cycle with a lag. The longer an economic expansion goes on and the longer bull market goes on, people's sense of disbelief is reduced. And they begin to believe more things that are too good to be true. And inevitably, when the cycle turns down and people get stingier with their capital, since most frauds today are by and large sort of Ponzi schemes or Ponzi schemes kind of once or twice removed, it gets harder to keep the game going because cheap capital is not available, and the business models collapse. And then we see the wrongdoing. And I've always joked that the best defense attorney and the best prosecutor for a company is its stock price. People don't get upset when they're making money on the upside. They look the other way on bad corporate behavior. The short sellers, the journalists, the naysayers will be pointing out that a guy's doing this, he's doing that, he's obviously lying, and people will shrug and go, so what? The stock's going up. But when people start losing money, boy, do they get upset. And press politically, legislators, law enforcement, regulators crack down. We saw that after the dot-com wave, right, with Enron and Sarbanes-Oxley. So where are the excesses today, and where might the gray area cross the bright line? And I think two areas are really areas to watch out for. The first is the fraud. I think the fraud that's hiding in plain sight, which is the aggressive and over-aggressive use of metrics rather than GAAP earnings. And we see it particularly in the lavish use of share-based compensation in Silicon Valley, but everywhere, where people simply are paying employees with stock and adding it back to pro forma earnings. Any way you cut it, compensation is an expense. It should be expense, whether paid in stock or cash. And then I could go on with all the adjustments to EBITDA in the private equity space, and we don't have time to get into all that. But a lot of the aggressive and maybe overly aggressive behavior is staring you in the face in this cycle, and a lot of it on the West Coast. And then if we want to go further west, I think the other area, and we saw it this morning with Luckett, you have to avoid these Chinese companies like the plague. I'm sorry. I mean, I know how many times investors have to be burned in these companies that are just too good to be true, growing at 40-50% a year, with all kinds of odd transactions with affiliates, variable interest entities based in Cayman Islands.
Hey Jim, I want to just clarify some of that because I think it's an important point. MSCI, as part of their index management, specifically over foreign stocks and emerging market stocks, have given China a greatly upgraded role in the makeup of those indices, to the point where investors buying overseas stocks increasingly own more China if they're hugging that benchmark. And let's face it, most are. So that's part one. Part two, the exchanges have somewhat blessed investing in Chinese companies by virtue of the fact that many of them are listed on either the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. So do you see those two things as being part of the risk here for most investors watching us right now?
Well, I think that those are certainly have contributed to investors' either love affair or overweight in China, and as well as the idea that now listen, I've been known a little bit as a glass half empty guy in China, to be fair, but the secular growth rate that China reports is awfully attractive to people. If the economy is really growing 6% a year and the rest of the world is struggling, why wouldn't I be looking there for secular growth stories? The problem is that an awful lot of those secular growth stories are manufactured literally for Western investors, and that's the problem. And so we had been as light in China, if you remember, about a year ago when you guys were talking to me, we were as low to the ground in China as we've been in years. We've been increasing our Chinese exposure in our global short funds and global hedge funds because I also see another problem, which is coming out of this crisis. I think U.S.-China relations are really have been harmed. And if we had seen some of the activities from China last year that we're seeing now, such as expelling all Western journalists, and really things like that, a year ago, I think people would have been running around with their hair on fire. But because it's happened in the backdrop of the virus, we've kind of neglected it. But things are getting much, much worse on the U.S.-China front. And if you think about things about corporate supply chains post-virus and reliance on imported products that are essential to our well-being and national security, I think, and even if you look at the Democratic positions, the Biden positions, and others, I mean, they've hardened as well. And so I suspect that things are going to get worse between the U.S. and China before they get better.
So you're as negative today on China as you were many years ago when you were the loudest voice.
Well, we were one of the only voices. No, we're not as negative as we were in 2010-11. We had about a quarter of our global short funds and hedge funds short China. But we got down as low as 5 last year, and I think we're a little bit over 10 right now.
So let me ask you, you said, one thing that makes it hard to stay short is when a stock gets creamed, like some of the energy ones have done and like Luckin has done today where you covered it all. The other is when a stock goes parabolic, like Tesla did over the winter.
Who?
Are you still short that, and how did that impact your thinking on your positioning?
So Tesla, and we told clients in January, February, that the 3-month period, sort of November, December, January, was one of the craziest periods I've ever seen in my 40 years on Wall Street. And if you remember, and I know Josh saw some of this stuff, and maybe some of your other panelists, retail for some reason came pouring into the market in individual names and individual stories in a way we haven't seen really since sort of January, February of 2000 at the end of the dot-com boom. And we saw the parabolas, we saw the Teslas, the Virgin Galactics, and others. And we saw it in the data of retail trading at E-Trade and options and Robinhood and so on and so forth. And I had not seen, that was the one thing that had been missing in this bull market in the 10 years, was just manic speculation by individuals. Well, sure enough, by January, February, we had it. And, we saw these stocks go parabolic. And if you're parabolic and you're short, obviously your position's getting much bigger. So in situations like that, if we like the name, like we like Tesla, we will have to cover some if it goes through our risk parameters, but then we will sell it even back down if we want to keep a maximum position. Again, one of the challenges of the short side is that you get bigger when it goes against you, and you get smaller when it goes your way. We are still basically maximum short Tesla. It's still one of my favorite positions. Nothing's changed in my viewpoint here. This is a car company. It will lose money again this year. What I find fascinating about Tesla is that the 2021 estimates, which track the stock on the way up, are now being cut dramatically. I think Tony Sacconaghi, who you know, cut his 2021 adjusted EPS number yesterday from $18 to $11. I mean, that's not affected by the virus. So, I mean, we're seeing big number cuts in this company. They're building 2 plants. They finished China. They're building Berlin. They are increasing capacity, I think, exactly at the wrong time. And if you know anything about manufacturing economics, you know that units, you also need to cover your overhead if you're building more and more capacity. And if you're not producing at 90+% of capacity, you're basically not going to be profitable.
But from a risk standpoint, you did cover some of the Tesla short when your position got larger because the stock had gone parabolic, as we said?
Yeah, we have a 5% limit on our funds. So if anything goes through 5%, we have to cover. But on the other hand, we will add on the way down if we still like the position. And it was a very instructive story, and that was a company called Valiant Pharmaceuticals that went from 130 to 260 on us, and we had to start covering stock at 180 and 200 on the way up. But then we sold it all the way down.
Do you think, though? The fundamentals of the balance sheet of the cash position have improved. You would admit that, though, correct?
Oh, yeah. It's not an insolvency story, at least not here and not yet. But it's also got a market cap, that's $89 billion and an over $100 billion total enterprise value. This is a company that hasn't made any money since its inception, and is not going to make any money this year, and is not going to have 1 million robo-taxis as it promised this year. And so it's a car company. It seems so simple to point that out to people, but you have to keep doing it. Car companies did trade at 1/2 of revenues. Now they trade at about 0.25 of revenues. And of course, Tesla is trading at 4 times revenues. So the risk reward is I think, somewhat self-evident.
I'm reminded of the Charlie Munger quote from months ago on this. I want to remind our viewers of it, and I know you know of it, but remind you as well and have you react to it, of Tesla. I would never buy it. I would never sell it short. I think Elon Musk is peculiar, and he may overestimate himself, but he may not be wrong all of the time. Is he onto something there about Musk himself and just the nature of the way that this stock trades? It's tough to be a player.
Well, I think that we talked a little bit earlier about my fraud course, and there's a wonderful model we use by a woman named Marianne Jennings, who wrote a great book, The 7 Signs of Ethical Collapse, and it's a checklist of all of the great frauds in history, and it's a seven-point checklist of attributes that all the great frauds have had in history. And all I'll say is that Tesla, I think, checks 6 or 7 of the boxes. And to Mr. Munger's comment, I don't know what that statement really says. I think that statement actually describes kind of almost everybody, right?
It's just this has been such you could theoretically be right about some, most, maybe all of the things you say, and yet the stock can work against you regardless, right? There are certain things that are a cult type stock. You know where I'm going when I bring up that. So regardless of the argument you make as to whether it is prudent, relevant, or fundamentally sound, it may not matter by the way that the market trades something, whether it's Tesla or something else. This just happens to be the example that we're using and to what Mr. Munger was speaking to. Well,
they're cult stocks until they aren't, Scott. And again, I think that when you price in the cult at basically 15 times where the rest of the industry is trading, it had better stay a cult stock because there's no margin for error. And I think that's the opportunity if you're a skeptic.
Jim, you know Rob Sechin. He's with us today, and he has a question for you, too. Rob?
Hey, Rob.
Hey, Jim. Great to have you on the show. I feel short selling plays a vital role in market function and keeping management honest, and you're one of the best at it. So thanks for being on. I have a couple questions for you.
Sure.
Do you think investors, 3 questions actually, are looking beyond like you are to 2021? Has that migration begun? That's number 1. Number 2, given the induced coma that we've kind of put the economy into, are you surprised at how well markets have held up? And does that have something to do with cash on the sidelines? And, is this ultimately going to be the death of passive investing and the indexification of markets? What are your thoughts on those topics?
I'll pass on the last one. I don't know. I'm generally a fan of passive investing. I sit on investment committees and allocate capital, as well as run my hedge fund. And I'm often the one advocating a big slug of passivity, because for most investors it makes sense. And so I'll sort of punt on that one. A couple of constructs, and again, with the overall view that I really don't know specifically where the market's going. But if you want to think in terms of frameworks, I don't think the market is screamingly cheap here. It's down a lot. But on the other hand, again, we can ignore 2020. But if you look at the S&P, I think last year was about $160 in earnings, give or take. And as we got before the virus hit, I think people were they were bringing their numbers down for 2021 to somewhere around that same number. But that's at a 21% tax rate. And I pointed out to people, in the not small chance that the Democrats take the White House and the Senate, and I know the Senate's much more of a toss-up right now, but if corporate tax rates were to go back to 35%, that $160 is $130, and so the S&P is kind of, all right. It's not 10 times, which is where a lot of bear markets bottom out at 10 times or less. In 2009, it was 8 times the previous peak's earnings. In 2007, earnings peaked out, I think, about $100 per S&P share, and I think the S&P got down to about 600, 650, 700. And that's been also the case in 2002 and go back to 1990. So they're not giving things away here, but they're certainly not as expensive as they were a month and a half ago.
Were you guys, when the market did get hit, pretty severely, obviously, 10 days ago or so?
Yep.
Were you buyers for in the hedge funds on the long side, thinking that the market had gone down too far too fast?
This 2 weeks ago, when I think about the 19th or the 18th or somewhere around there where it bottomed out, I think I'd have to go double check, but I think we were probably net buyers. Yeah, I'm virtually certain of it. Just because lots of things got down to prices that where the risk reward for what we do is just not there anymore. But then a lot of things snapped back dramatically. I mean, we had some stocks up 100% in the following 7-8 days.
How do you view things like the airlines here or hotels, things that have obviously gotten hit from a stock standpoint and who are going to be facing a lot of trouble going forward? Yeah,
we weren't in the cruise lines or the airlines. As you know, we're in the casinos, and I just think those are such troubled business models, and you're really going to have to figure out, as I indicated at the beginning of the show, what do these business models look like coming out of this, right? They're disasters this year, we know that. But, airlines, I can give you a pretty educated guess. Airlines are still going to be around. I don't particularly think they're great businesses, but they're going to be around. So you can look in the capital structure and see maybe there's something interesting to do. Cruise lines? I don't get it. I haven't gotten it all along. They're non-U.S. taxpayers. They're flags of convenience companies. They wanted U.S. taxpayer assistance, which was patently absurd in my view. And I think that business is probably permanently harmed. So it just depends. I mean, and what are we going to do as a society? Is this going to be like 9/11, where our lives changed, right? We gave up small personal freedoms when we traveled or whatever because of security issues. Are we going to congregate as much coming out of this? Are there going to be costs for companies that are involved in dealing with the mass public? That whether it's higher insurance costs, higher health-related costs, whatever it might be. I mean, I think investors have to really kind of put sharp pencils to this when they look at business models coming out of the virus to figure out are my companies going to be permanently changed or is it purely temporary? Let
me talk more about sort of on the theme of coming out of this, because another company that you've been short is Uber. And Dara Khosrowshahi, the CEO, commented a couple of weeks ago about this very thing. I'm going to read the quote, and we can get your reaction on the other side of it. Our balance sheet is incredibly strong. He said we have plenty of liquidity on the books, which we think positions us to come out of this crisis, and we will come out of this crisis strong, capable, and important. Now, their bookings are obviously down because of the virus. That's no surprise. But the fact of what he is saying about the other side, do you disagree with him?
I do disagree on one major point, and one of the reasons we're still short all of the gig economy type companies is that I think that their entire business model is based on this labor arbitrage. That basically their employees, their drivers, in effect, are not employees. And that is huge because keep in mind that right now the cost to keep an employee beyond salary is usually 20% of someone's revenues in the form of payroll taxes, unemployment pool taxes, and a variety of other taxes for employers. And usually the employee pays about half of that. In the case of the gig economy, the employee is paying all of that. And so it's why a lot of these drivers realize they're not making much more, or if not even less, than minimum wage when they factor in all of their additional expenses. And that's why these businesses exist. I mean, you know, it's a taxi cab business that's been around a long, long time. And so I think that if you're a gig economy investor, you have to at least consider the possibility that the entire labor relations aspect of this business model is going to change. And I think that's really important.
And if it does change, as you say, it might. And, you know, I've seen some politicians in Washington over the last couple of days bringing up this very issue related to the virus and what happens afterwards. And the people who are struggling right now, who were driving Ubers, whether it was part-time or even full-time, who are now doing it no time. Yeah. You think that's a net negative, even if that changes the way the company operates after this?
Well, I mean, obviously, I think they're going to have the company's going to have higher payroll-related expenses. And so the question will be then, investors, will they be able to charge consumers more if they do that? And you know, that remains to be seen. But, you know, it's a fundamentally unprofitable business model. And even when Uber says, well, we're going to be adjusted EBITDA positive, you know, I think he said fourth quarter of 2020, not 2021. People got excited. You know, I kept pointing out to people, yeah, that's before share-based compensation, which is running almost $500 million a year. And so are they really profitable if they're not counting that? And so this is the problem. If you look at Grubhub, I mean, just look what they did recently. If you want to talk about bad actors, they did this promotion. They promoted a promotion with their restaurants where they urged the restaurants to offer big discounts and deliver through Grubhub. And then in the fine print, they told the restaurants that they, of course, would not take cuts in their cut. And so, you know, this is somewhat of an almost predatory business model. And for the food delivery guys, I think they've got an even more existential issue, which is I just think a lot of the independent restaurants, which is where they make their money, they don't make money in the McDonald's of the world.
You're still short Grub?
Still one of my favorite positions. And I think that structurally they just don't make money. And here's your tell on Grubhub. If Grubhub doesn't make any money in the first half of 2020, I would argue they're probably never going to make money.
They did give us a statement, by the way, because what you do say about this so-called Suffer for Support program that the company was running is in fact true. The price of the discount that Grub was saying falls on the shoulders of the restaurants, not Grubhub paying the discount, as it were. They say, and I'm just going to read this for our viewers, they say since it launched, participants have seen 30% more orders on average. And so because it is working well for those restaurants, Grubhub is doubling down on the promotion and encouraging more sign-ups by giving $250 to each participating restaurant. Based on the results so far, we anticipate this funding from Grubhub will help generate $100 million in restaurant sales and cost to Grubhub of approximately $30 million. We did ask them for a statement about this program, and that's how they did respond, Jim.
Yeah, well, they were caught out in it, and I don't think that when they made that announcement originally, they had that program. So I think they've gotten lambasted on social media and the press by restaurants for doing that when they rolled it out. So good for them if they're going to try to give that back. But it still gets to my problem, which is I just don't think this is a profitable business. And where they are getting higher delivery through the fast food outlets, Grubhub themselves said they don't make any money in that business, delivering burgers.
Is there a way, though? I'm just wondering, sort of on the other side. Forgive me for interrupting you. I'm wondering on the other side of this, if the world does change to some respects. And I think we all think that in some ways it will. What if, you know, look, there was a talk about a possible deal for this company months ago, which, you know, to some may have sounded outlandish in the suggestion of, well, who would potentially buy them? But if you look down the road and you do see the world and habits changing in some way, is a company like this more attractive to a bigger player because people will, in fact, want delivered food more often than going into a restaurant, and restaurants may be half the size in some cases on the other side? Here's
the conundrum with that question, Scott. If you don't make any money delivering for the big chains, which is where a lot of the volume is, and you're only making money delivering for an independent restaurant, and independent restaurants survive this, coming out of this, why will independent restaurants ultimately not do this themselves and just pay an agency fee? Why do they need to give up 20% of the take to a third party? This has been profitless prosperity for the restaurants in good times. And it doesn't scale. Delivery guys can only do 2 deliveries an hour. It's not like other Silicon Valley network effect companies. It's literally a body shop. You have to have more drivers to do deliveries, and that's the inherent problem. I think it's never going to be profitable.
Let me.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. No, I was going to say I wanted to bring in another one of our panelists to get a question in. We're running through time so fast. As often happens in these interviews. Jenny Harrington, do you have a question for Jim?
Sure. Thanks, Jim. I'd love to circle back to one of your earlier comments where you said you took your shorts in energy off in the beginning of the week. If you took your shorts off, it would presume that you expect there to be upside from here. So I was curious if you're exploring any purchases in the energy space and if there's any theme around that, either company specific or micro industry, where you're actually finding value and think that there could be upside.
Yeah, I mean, I've not been a fan of Scott Knows for a long time. I would tell your viewers, avoid the frackers. That's a simple blanket statement. Long or short, just avoid them. They incinerate capital. It's not a business. It's a scheme. More money has gone into the ground than has come out. And so we've been negative on that space since 2014. We remain negative. It's difficult because right now it's such a play on the commodity price, even for the integrated. And I haven't done any work recently on the pipeline, so I'll avoid that. I know some value people are nosing around that sector. But even the integrated, who just had just ironclad balance sheets. Remember when Exxon had an ironclad balance sheet? It doesn't anymore. And nor do the other majors who paid big dividends and generally were pretty conservative holdings for investors. So it's a tough area. I think it's going to get tougher. Balance sheets have deteriorated, not gotten better. And then you have this whole problem where the fracking business model isn't really just a business model. It's an accounting scam. They never depreciated the wells fast enough. And so, by and large, the stocks have come down so much, the risk-reward was kind of gone on the short side and better elsewhere. But I'm not a big fan of the industry.
Jim Lebenthal, you have something for Jim?
Yeah, if I can just start off by saying, as a long equity manager, I have a lot of respect for short sellers. I know that's not only what you do, Mr. Chanos, but it helps in price discovery. It's real money that you have at risk. And when I'm entering a position, if I believe in the position, one of the metrics I look at is what's the short interest. Because as you pointed out, you have to cover at some point in time. So if there's no accounting fraud, short interest can be very helpful. But my question to you is, we're living in this world where every day something's coming out of the federal government, whether it gets enacted or not. And as an example, one of the things that's being talked about is maybe we get an infrastructure bill. That wasn't really talked about a week ago. The question is, you have real money at risk on the short side, and the losses can be infinite if things go awry. Are you in any way overly worried about any given morning there could be something coming out of the federal government that dramatically changes your investment thesis on the short side, and what do you do about that?
Well, again, we're in our hedge fund, we're net long, as I indicated, and in our short programs, for the most part, we are compensated on how we do relative to the market. So I've always joked I'm in the insurance business. I don't think I'm short any companies right now that would be directly benefited by an infrastructure bill. And as for government involvement affecting the stock market at this point in my career, I'm pretty much resigned to the fact that there's always going to be government involvement in the financial markets. It seems to be getting worse, not better, as it relates to the government deciding to spend taxpayer money to support various different industries. Now, an infrastructure bill is probably overdue. It should have been done a long time ago, given where rates are. But we always worry about that kind of stuff, and the government is increasingly of the belief that it needs to rescue various industries. I would point out, to go back to the airlines, on Monday, I pointed out to clients that the airlines, the 4 or 5 largest publicly traded airlines in the United States had a $50 billion total market capitalization in equity. Why are we talking about equity grants? If Carnival Cruise Line can raise money in the debt and bond market and equity markets, why aren't American Airlines, United Airlines, and so on raising equity in the stock market? Why does the taxpayer need to do that? And that's just a philosophical issue I have, which I think we probably don't need to get into. But yeah, Jim, I mean, we always worry about that stuff, and we're always, can the government do something in an area that we're negative on that would affect valuation and perception? Sure.
You're obviously not the only one, Jim, who is looking at the current landscape of bailouts and rescue plans and taking issue with certain parts of them, obviously. Josh Brown, I know you wanted to get in earlier, and we are running out of time. What do you have?
Well, real quick, I think the answer to why the airlines aren't in the debt markets right now might have to do with something they're discussing with Omaha, but we'll find out. I want to push back on Uber. I'm long the stock. I don't disagree with everything that you've said, but here are 3 things the bulls would say back to you. The first is, unfortunately, the pool of available labor for Uber drivers is now substantially bigger, given the unemployment numbers that we've seen in the last 2 weeks. 2, mass transit might be more at risk than Uber coming out of this. How many people are now thinking about, well, how am I going to get to work from now on if I no longer want to be on a commuter train, a subway, or a bus? So they might actually benefit at the margins for middle class, upper middle class commuters. And then the third thing is, I'm not so sure that there'll be the political will to change the employment structure for companies like this. And one example of that is they're now including self-employed people in the unemployment insurance package that's coming from Treasury, sole props. They're going to treat them as though a company laid them off. So it almost seems like they're being entrenched. What would you say to those 3 points that a bull might make on Uber specifically? And I own the stock, by the way.
Okay. Well, so in reverse order, I think that you're actually making my point. I think that employers will be put into those pools. That is, I think that because we are covering these drivers and self-employed people, as I think we should, I think that
right.
that employers should be paying half those costs as CNBC pays half of Scott's and Kinnikos pays half of mine, and that the employee should shoulder the same amount, whether he's an quote-unquote independent contractor. So I think that the cost of doing business from a payroll point of view from the Ubers and Grubhubs of the world is going to go up. Now, skipping to the first part of your question, will the available number of employees increase? Well, if unemployment becomes structural, possibly. But if unemployment becomes structural, I'll cede that point to you, Josh, and figure out that a lot of my other companies are going to have much bigger problems. I'm assuming that the unemployment will not be structural, and that we will get a bounce back, and therefore labor rates are going to stay the same or maybe even rise. And so I think that the unbridled capitalism, where everybody's going to fight for these minimum wage jobs, I think could in fact see additional regulation, not only on the payroll tax side, but in restrictive minimum wage and other things. So I think we just disagree on that front. As to the second point, I think that's the interesting one. I've heard both sides of saying that I'm never going to take mass transit because it's just it's too many people and too confined to space. And then I've heard I don't want to get in someone's car. I don't know who's driving me. I don't know what whether they cleaned the vehicle, who's been in it before. I'm definitely less than 6 feet in that vehicle, and so I don't know. We'll have to see how that plays out. The problem, again, in this industry, though, is at the micro level. It's not economic. That these are body shops, quite literally.
Let me. I only have a couple minutes left, Jimmy. Yep. I want to ask you one more question about a stock, if you will, that you're very long. Ticker symbol is Joe B, as in Joe Biden. How is this all going to impact how is the virus going to impact his ability to campaign? We already know, literally, we came on the air today, the convention announcement had come out that it's being pushed back. How is that all going to impact him? What are your thoughts? Have you spoken with him recently?
I've not spoken with the vice president very recently, but I've certainly spoken with his team and have been in touch with the campaign almost every day. As you know, I'm close to the vice president. I think stepping back before I talk specifics there, and I don't know a whole lot more than what the public knows, I would say that I think the political dynamic will change. And I suspect as the virus subsides and or vanishes, hopefully, I think that the discourse is going to get a lot sharper and the elbows are going to get a lot sharper. And sadly, they've already been pretty sharp, as we know, right? But I suspect when fear turns to anger, you're going to see a different dynamic in a lot of races around the country. And that's why I'm kind of keeping my eye on the Senate races as well. Look, the convention, I'm a Milwaukee native. I was looking forward to the convention this summer and hitting up a few Brewers games and eating some brats, but we'll see what happens there. I think that there will be a stark dichotomy between the two candidates and the two parties, probably more than ever coming out of this in the fall. I don't think the markets are focused on that right now. I don't think the markets are focused on the healthcare debate, which I think will kick back in, in terms of our healthcare economy and what should be provided and what shouldn't. I suspect the virus might even blur the lines between the parties on some of these issues, on things like employment and healthcare. And so it's going to be I think it's going to be kind of a wild and woolly fall. And we'll see what happens. I think the vice president has correctly been mindful of where we are and is not trying to make big political points on it. I think that's the right strategy. But I also think that the administration will be held to account when the time comes. And so I suspect the political rhetoric will be up post-summer. That's about the best I can say.
I understand. I really appreciate you being with us today. It's been a while. And it's always an interesting conversation, discussion. Jim, thank you so much.
I'm so happy that you invited me on. Guys, stay safe, everybody. Josh, we got to do a steak soon.
Mm-hmm. You as well. Jim, you be well, stay safe, and stay healthy for certain. That's Jim Chanos, the Kinnikos Association founder.
I just think it's just an amazing moment.
Yeah, so Mohammed, so
Brad is very musical and he loves playing instruments. He told me that I can reach my soul through music, and this is something new that I heard from him. Today is the school concert and I'm singing in it. We started practicing at the beginning of this half and I really enjoyed it. It's the first singing experience for me. The piece of music is called Requiem by Vade.
It's been a formative term for Mohammed, who's heading home for Easter, and the Requiem is a fitting end.
He's been busy, he's flourishing, and it's having an impact on his academic work as well. He's always strong, and he's getting stronger. I'm very fortunate to have a house filled with musicians. He's taken part in an extraordinary occasion, and I think he's coming around to my way of thinking. That actually, it is what makes us who we are.
which is massive, I think, compared to many other ones in my year. This is the first exams for me in the country. I want to do I think well.
This term is dominated by exams, but the boys do get a morning off to watch the wedding of the year.
Watching a royal wedding from the country that it's being in is very exciting.
She's amazing! I love you!
It was a great wedding in a very nice area in London, but it was very long as well. Generally, I'm not really keen on kingdoms and monarchies. What makes the royal family better than other people in the world?
Mohammed has had a busy few weeks, but finally it's his last exam today.
Now I'm not very nervous, but this is the last minute revision. When I was in Lebanon, I was the top of the class, and now here, like any other student, so I have to do well. It was very tiring for me. I had 5 exams from Monday until Friday today, so I had to do lots of revision, especially in the last 2 days. I think the difficult period has passed now.
With exams over, Mohammed can enjoy the English summer.
So when you go like that and you put your arm down, that's where you want the ball to go.
When I ball and he bats and someone catches the ball, you mean, so he will be out. Okay.
If it's
okay.
back. Go back.
I can't see very well. Yeah, bowling is nice, but I think I have to get the hang of it. Like.
Eton's most famous annual event is called the 4th of June and commemorates the birthday of George III. It's a reminder of the privileged education that the boys receive.
There's a slight danger that they may pass through Eton with the notion that they are more special really than they are, because it is an unusual place which has a lot of cultural baggage, historical baggage. So actually probably more important is that while they appreciate and recognise the opportunity they have, they don't go away thinking they're too special.
I met many boys who were really friendly with me, and I discovered after that they are from very elite families in the country. They are not really arrogant about their backgrounds, so it's one of the things that makes me more confident at the school.
Eton has a long tradition of rowing, and the day's highlight is watching the splendid procession of boats.
Started in 1793, and it is certainly today a wonderful spectacle, at least thanks to the hats so carefully and lovingly prepared by the boys' dames.
Well, I've seen boys rowing before, but it's a special thing today because they are wearing these special suits with the hats, the funny hats with the flowers. It's really nice.
With his first year nearing the end, Mohammed visits the family that has funded his scholarship. He's just one of 40 international students that they have had.
You sort of lose a little bit of faith and a little bit of hope in terms of the political process. I think that means positive resolution, at least in my life. And so you do what you can. And I mean, you try and empower young people and hope that they will then improve the lives of people in their community. In terms of the long term, I mean, do you see yourself going back to Lebanon, or do you see yourself staying around here? Or I mean,
it's my aim to return back to Lebanon. You do. Yeah, I want to study here, then go back to Lebanon, try to help my people. I mean, Palestinians who live in camps, they really suffer from very bad conditions. So I think it's the duty of people who have chances like me to go there and help changing these bad conditions for people.
Mohammed's applying to study engineering at university, but it's one of the professions that he can't practice in Lebanon because he's a Palestinian refugee.
Every time I think about my future, I find situations as obstacles for me. But I have to work hard, even if I find obstacles in my way.
It's the end of term, and Wainfleet is packing up.
There's nothing else to go with.
Mohammed has been invited on a trip to Europe with some of the boys before he heads home to Lebanon.
I don't know who's more excited, actually.
I'm very excited.
I know you are, but we are too for you.
Thank you, man. Enjoy your summer. Bye-bye.
Great, yeah.
Bye-bye, man.
Have a great summer, and we'll see you in September.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. مع السلامة. I think my experience here broadened my mind. I became more confident, more thoughtful, and more aware about what's happening in the world. And I reached a point in between my old culture and this culture. But I am Mohammed. I'm still Mohammed. I'm still Palestinian. And I think my experience made me more conscious about helping other people.
That was more than 6 years ago, and I'm sure you're wondering, what's happened to him? Well, I'm pleased to say that he is joining us now from our London studio. Great to see you, Mohammed. So as we've mentioned, you graduated from Eton in 2012. What's happened since?
I was very fortunate to be awarded another scholarship by the Horizon Foundation to continue my studies at UCL in London. I was awarded a job offer in London at a global engineering consultancy called Mott MacDonald, where I've been working for more than a year now.
What sort of projects are you working on there?
I've been mainly working on two projects. The first one is a road expansion in the US, actually. After that, I started working on a huge scheme in London called Crossrail 2, and the aim is to build a new railway that connects West London with Northeast London.
Do you have any plans of going back to Lebanon or even going to Palestine?
The reality at the moment is that as a Palestinian, I'm deprived from the right of return to Palestine because of the Israeli occupation. The United Nations has reaffirmed our right as Palestinians to go back to our home countries. Every single year, since 1948, since my grandparents were kicked out, the United Nations Resolution 194 affirmed our right to go back, but we've never been allowed to go. My grandmother, who was featured in this documentary, passed away 2 years ago without achieving her dream of going back. So in terms of going to Lebanon, I love Lebanon because my parents are there. I miss them, they miss me. But the problem is that as Palestinians in Lebanon, we're deprived from many civil rights. We are not allowed to work in more than 20 professions. Me as a civil engineer, I wouldn't be able to practice in Lebanon. Many of my friends who have graduated from university have actually gone back to Lebanon, and at the moment they are still unemployed.
And so where is it going to be now, and how does your family feel that this has so far been a one-way journey for you?
My dream is to move to Palestine, and the ultimate goal at home is actually Palestine. But at the same time, I still have my childhood memories of Lebanon. I love Lebanon because I grew up there. My family is there. The UK, on the other hand, has provided me with life-changing opportunities. I spent the formative years of my life here. I made many friends. I worked with friends. So I will always have the connection, but home will continue to be in the back of my mind, Palestine.
Well, thank you very much, Mohammed, for joining us and telling us about your life. Well, that's it for this week. You can find lots of other specially selected films on the Rewind page of the Al Jazeera website. For now, until next time, goodbye.
Greece, the birthplace of democracy. But ethnic Turks from the northeast tell a different story.
They want to control our religion,
our jailed, journalists silenced, schools closed, and a surge in the far right.
They say that if you don't like Greece, you can go Turkey. Why? I'm Turkish, but I'm also Greek.
People and Power investigates Western threats contested. Al Jazeera.
A history of guerrilla warfare. A place on the global stage. They were an organization created for a stateless population. But before fighting for their land, why did the PLO fight for independence and freedom? Chronicling the turbulent story of the struggle for a Palestinian homeland. PLO, History of a Revolution, on Al Jazeera. When the news breaks.
And economic development.
When people need to be heard.
The top leadership were aware of the potential severity of the virus weeks before the public were told of those dangers.
Al Jazeera has teams on the ground.
The Syrian army seems determined to defeat the virus and continues advancing
to bring you more award-winning documentaries and live news.
The U.S. overtakes Italy to become the country with the highest number of coronavirus deaths in the world. I'm Rob Matheson. This is a second straight day. The government's being criticized for how it's handling the pandemic. Taking matters into its own hands, a city in the Philippines brings in national testing to try to flatten the curve. Joining forces to contain the outbreak, Google and Apple are developing an online system to let you know if you've been in contact with someone who's infected. The U.S. now has the highest number of coronavirus deaths in the world, 20,000 people. Its tally passed Italy on Friday. Across the U.S., at least 500,000 people are infected. More than half of the U.S. deaths are in 3 states, New York, New Jersey, and Michigan. The epicenter remains New York. The surge of deaths there has overwhelmed funeral homes and the city's using a mass burial site. But the state governor said for the first time there's been a drop in severe admissions. New York City has decided to shut down schools for the rest of the academic year.
You can see that the number is somewhat stabilizing, but it is stabilizing at a horrific rate. 783 people, 777, 799. These are just incredible numbers, depicting incredible loss and pain.
John Hendren's joined us now from Chicago. Andrew Cuomo, they're saying that these are incredible numbers. What does this mean for the U.S.?
Well, Rob, every day we seem to hit a new grim milestone. On Friday, it was that the United States had crossed 500,000 recorded cases of coronavirus. On Saturday, it is that the U.S. has now registered 20,000 deaths, more than any other country, including Italy. And as you point out, 1/3 of those cases was from New York State alone, New York, New Jersey, and Michigan being the hardest hit of all states so far. And U.S. health officials say they believe that the infections are going to peak on Easter Sunday, this coming Sunday. That was originally a date when President Trump had said he wanted the U.S. to come out of the shelter-in-place orders and wanted business to be back and moving again. That is no longer happening. That date seems to have moved to May 1st, and there are a lot of public health officials who are skeptical even about that date. But there are places here in the United States where pastors are keeping churches open. Most states, 43 states, have lockdown orders. 7 of them do not. But of the states that have lockdown orders, something like 15 of them allow exemption for church services. So there is some fear that here on Easter Sunday, there will be places where massive amounts of people will be gathering. But Anthony Fauci, the head of the National Institutes of Health here in the United States, says that there won't be a sense of normalcy here in the U.S. until something like November, and that, of course, is when President Trump is up for re-election.
John, you mentioned Michigan there, and I understand it's bringing in some of its strictest coronavirus laws of pretty much any state. What's behind that?
That's right. Because the virus is hitting Michigan right now, the Midwest here in Chicago, where I am, and the state of Michigan have both been hit pretty hard. The governor there, Gretchen Whitmer, has issued a new order, and that requires people to stay in their homes except for essential tasks like getting groceries. And they are barred even from visiting their own vacation homes. And a lot of people in Michigan have them. So Michigan is cracking down, just trying to keep people indoors in a way that no other state really is. But the problem here in the United States is that some states have strict orders, some don't. So the virus is sort of it doesn't respect state orders. And governors are trying to get together on this, but there are a number of them that continue to resist stricter orders. So whether this helps the state of Michigan or whether those cases continue to flood over those borders is an open question, because people from other states are going to be allowed to visit their own vacation homes in Michigan, even while residents of Michigan cannot.
John Hendren bringing us up to date from Chicago. The number of confirmed cases in the U.S. has risen dramatically in the 4 weeks since the crisis began. And critics of President Donald Trump say his slow response is largely to blame. Here's our White House correspondent, Kimberly Hawkett.
He has betrayed our national security.
When the U.S. reported its first coronavirus case on January 20th, the United States was in the midst of another crisis.
The Senate will convene as a court of impeachment.
The impeachment trial against President Donald Trump, something he said was a distraction for the country. But did the political drama also leave the president distracted from leading a response to the COVID-19 outbreak hitting the United States? Trump says he took the virus seriously from the start.
I felt it was a pandemic long before it was called a pandemic. All you had to do is look at other countries.
But his public statements suggest otherwise. In January, as the World Health Organization warned of a global crisis and coronavirus cases in China grew, Trump banned Chinese citizens from traveling to the U.S., but continued to downplay the threat.
We have it totally under control. It's one person coming in from China.
He suggested it would go away by April, as lawmakers expressed fears the U.S. was unprepared.
I'm deeply concerned that we are way behind the 8 ball on this.
By late February, as coronavirus gripped states like Washington and California, lawmakers on Capitol Hill publicly questioned administration officials regarding whether enough resources had been stockpiled to deal with the crisis.
We do have in the Strategic National Stockpile ventilators, we have masks, we have...
Enough?
Well, of course not, or we wouldn't be asking for a supplemental to seek more money to procure more of that.
But by March, Trump widened travel restrictions to include some European countries. He also declared a national emergency in the U.S. Still, as coronavirus cases expanded, Trump continued to downplay the problem.
It's going to disappear. One day it's like a miracle, it will disappear.
He accused his Democratic opponents of weaponizing coronavirus for political purposes and harming his re-election chances.
And this is their new hoax.
Only as hundreds of new coronavirus cases emerged across the U.S. did the White House announce national social distancing guidelines. It prompted closures of most U.S. businesses overnight, causing millions of Americans to lose their jobs and obliterate the once booming U.S. economy. Looking for a scapegoat, Trump blamed China.
It's not racist at all, no, not at all. It comes from China.
And contradicting public health officials, Trump continued to project optimism, telling Americans he wanted businesses reopened by Easter. But as cases of coronavirus rose, Trump reluctantly expanded public health restrictions.
We will be extending our guidelines to April 30th to slow the spread.
President Trump has justified the mixed messages from his coronavirus task force, arguing he's the country's cheerleader, providing hope to Americans in a difficult time. But one analyst argues with the November presidential election on the horizon, Trump's response is driven by his desire to win a second term.
As you know, the saying goes, never let a good crisis go to waste. This is a president who has used at every opportunity this crisis to attempt to solidify himself, solidify his base, and solidify his reelection.
We appreciate it very much.
Trump continues to praise White House response efforts, giving himself a 10 out of 10, even as critics accuse him of failing to respond swiftly to save thousands of lives. Kimberly Halkett, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Jason Nichols is a political analyst and a lecturer at the University of Maryland. He's joining us now from Ellicott City. We appreciate your time, sir. How would you characterize the way that Donald Trump has handled this?
I think, you know, as we say here in Maryland, the proof is in the pudding. I think that he has been horrendous. Number one, his failure started about a year ago when he dismantled the pandemic response team, which is part of the NCS. Or the NSC, excuse me. He has numerous times tried to cut the budget of the CDC and of NIH, which handle these types of situations. He called it a hoax. His one step to stop this was to stop him, movement from China. But we find out later on that this virus actually came to our country from Italy, or excuse me, from somewhere in Europe. So he has failed at every turn. Testing has been slow. We've seen that South Korea was able to test 66,000 people in 1 week. It took the United States of America, the wealthiest country on the planet, 3 weeks to test the same amount of people. He's playing political games with ventilators and with American lives. So it's very frustrating to watch his response to this pandemic.
If we weren't facing a presidential election in November, do you think that Donald Trump would have handled this differently?
Honestly, Rob, I would say no. I think Donald Trump, in many cases, is unprepared, underprepared, does not have the right people around him advising him. I think he would not have taken this seriously regardless. And I don't think that this has to do with an election coming up. I think it has to do with incompetence. So that's what I think this comes down to. I really don't think that this is some sort of political game he played from the beginning. I think it's that he was incompetent. He has poor judgment. He doesn't listen to good advice, and he has bad advice in the other ear.
We are nevertheless, of course, facing the election that's coming up in November. Do you think that this is going to have, despite what you've said, and I accept what you say, that this is going to have any bearing on how people are likely to vote in November?
Well, Rob, I sure hope so. But I don't, we've seen this president be impeached. We've seen him through several scandals, both domestic and international, and he seems to be Teflon. Things seem to just kind of slip off of him. I think we're facing a tough election coming up. It's going to be a close one. But to say that this is a breaking point and that the American people have had enough, Even with all of the deaths, where, as you stated in your package, about 20,000 Americans have succumbed to coronavirus, I'm not so certain that this is going to tip the scales in any major way. I think he's still going to have his base. They make excuses for him, and he has his sycophants in the media who are always going to back him regardless, even if it costs Americans' lives. So will it have some effect? Could it push the needle a slight amount? Perhaps. But is it going to be some sort of landslide because of these dramatic failures? I don't think so.
Let me ask you this, and if you don't mind, if I could ask you to be brief, because unfortunately time is slightly against us. If this is not going to have any impact on the election in November, we are talking about a significant number of people who have lost loved ones, relatives, friends, family to this virus. There are going to be those who will blame the White House for what has happened. What action do you think they can take to show their displeasure if you don't think that this is going to have any bearing on the election in November?
So, again, I'm not going to say that there won't be any bearing. I think in some states, hopefully, states like Michigan, there will be some bearing. But I think what will happen regardless is that we'll see a reinstatement of the pandemic response team, that we will see our stockpile replenished, and we will always have the PPE, the personal protective gear for our healthcare professionals. And regardless of the outcome of the election, we'll be prepared for another pandemic, God forbid one that comes about. But I think that it could push the needle slightly, but I don't think there's a big dramatic change one way or the other. We're a very polarized nation, unfortunately.
Really good to get your thoughts on this. Jason, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Rob.
Health officials in the UK say the outbreak is yet to reach its peak there, and death toll is closer to 10,000. The government's repeated its warning to the public to stick to the lockdown restrictions over the Easter weekend, even though the warm weather is forecast.
These stark figures highlight the gravity of this national emergency, the devastating impact of this virus, and the unprecedented but necessary action that we are taking to tackle it is affecting every aspect of our daily lives. But my message to anyone still refusing to do the right thing is clear. If you don't play your part, our selfless police, who are out there risking their own lives to save others, will be unafraid to act.
Well, the daily death toll in the UK is expected to continue to rise, but as Mariam Namazi reports from London, there does seem to be some hope.
The numbers are still very high, and they're expected to increase further in the coming days and weeks. Actually, this is in line with expectations as the emergency starts to reach its peak. You can see the daily death toll reaching the 1,000 level, or just thereabouts here in the UK. And in fact, in the last few days, the UK already surpassed Italy and Spain for recording the highest number of daily deaths. Now, interestingly, we were also hearing from the director of NHS England, Stephen Powis, and he was saying that there has also been a flattening in the number of confirmed cases and also in the number of hospitalizations, and that is really important. So, and that's not just in London, but also in other parts of the country. But he did say that it will take some time for us to see the effect of that in the death toll figures because of this time lag with the virus. It takes time for an infected person to start to show symptoms, and then there's again time before they deteriorate to the point of needing to go to hospital, and then sadly if they might die. And so because of that time lag, you are likely to see a continued increase in the death toll in the coming days and probably this week.
Iran is one of the countries hardest hit by COVID-19. It started reopening government offices after a brief nationwide lockdown. It's got more than 70,000 confirmed cases, while more than 4,300 people have died. Zain Basrawi has more from Tehran.
Weeks into the pandemic, health officials confirmed what many Iranians feared. The coronavirus had been spreading through the population undetected since January, the month before the parliamentary election. There is little doubt now the election contributed to the spread of the virus. Days after the first cases were confirmed in the city of Qom on February 19th, Iran's deputy health minister showed obvious symptoms during a media briefing, later confirming he was infected. In the days that followed, COVID-19 spread quickly through the ranks of government. Still, President Hassan Rouhani initially downplayed the crisis. During the first meeting of a task force he set up to respond to the outbreak, he predicted the emergency would be over in a matter of days.
Iran's enemies are plotting to scare our society and push the country towards a shutdown. As of Saturday, everything should return to normal.
2 months in, the government reports thousands are dead and tens of thousands infected. Iran has asked the International Monetary Fund for a $5 billion emergency loan to fight the virus. The government here says the White House is blocking it. Since day one of the outbreak, Iran's leaders have had to weigh shutdowns for the sake of public health against the cost to an economy stifled by U.S. sanctions. Foreign Minister Javad Zarif has described America's maximum pressure campaign as an economic siege that makes it more difficult for Iran to do its part to fight the global spread of the virus, something that he says could make COVID-19 a forever pandemic.
Even amid this pandemic, the U.S. government has vengefully refused to lift its unlawful and collective punishment, making it virtually impossible for us to even buy medicine and medical equipment.
The Trump administration reimposed economic sanctions after pulling out of the nuclear deal in 2018. Health experts have warned the coronavirus remains a serious public threat. But by order of the president, all events to return to normal in Iran this week. The capital Tehran, the economic engine of the country, is expected to see businesses reopen by the end of April. It's a country where small and medium enterprises make up a bulk of the economy, and financial experts have warned President Rouhani prolonged closures will make social unrest and street protests inevitable.
Iran's government is making a desperate choice at a time of a global crisis, the health and safety of its people versus the well-being of its economy. It's a decision that many Iranians say the country could afford to put off if it wasn't for the economic pressure from U.S. sanctions.
Researchers in China have discovered airborne traces of the virus can travel up to 4 meters away from patients. It had been thought to only reach 2 meters. The study tested surface and air samples from wards treating infected people at a hospital in Wuhan. Researchers found the virus was mainly concentrated on the floors, and some medical staff had picked it up on their shoes. Dr. James Trower is a senior research fellow and head of epidemiological modeling at Monash University. He explains why not all countries are following the World Health Organization's advice on masks.
We've previously had the understanding that it's been predominantly droplet and fomite transmission, which means that it can transmit on objects, it can last up to 72 hours on surfaces. It's possible that that is one of the reasons why it's spreading more rapidly, and those new results from China will have to be interpreted with what we previously understood about the virus. I think one of the biggest reasons why it's transmitting so rapidly is because it's so asymptomatic. We have people who are asymptomatic for a period of time, up to some days before they develop symptoms, or who remain asymptomatic entirely through the duration of their illness. And I think they're important factors as well.
As demand grows in the Philippines for coronavirus testing, one city is going it alone with its own screening program in an effort to flatten the curve. Jamila Alandon reports.
It's described as the first localized mass testing program for the coronavirus here. Like many cities, Valenzuela is grappling with the pandemic. And with help from these health workers, they say they're taking matters into their own hands to set up their own testing system, separate from the national government. Their aim is to stop the disease from spreading. The first to get tested are some in this neighborhood, described here as persons under investigation who may have contracted the virus or been in contact with infected people. Frontline workers such as doctors and nurses are expected to get tested as well.
So that's the significance. It's making it more focused, targeting the resources where it's needed the most.
Previously, requests for a limited amount of testing kits had to be made to the national government, and it would take at least a week before results arrived. With thousands of kits at their disposal and with a hospital that can process these tests, the results should only take 2 days to come through.
So now we have an affiliate private hospital
they are capable now to perform the test as certified by the Department of Health, and it was inspected by RITM and the WHO.
More than 60 million Filipinos have been forced to stay at home after President Duterte declared a national health emergency a few weeks ago.
At points where everyone has become familiar seeing, the government says the lockdown is necessary to prevent a further outbreak in many communities. But more and more experts say this is simply not enough, and there are growing calls for the government to conduct mass testing in many communities.
The health system in the country is clearly in crisis. Most hospitals are full, and the number of health workers dying from the virus continues to rise. So testing efforts like this one are seen as a major breakthrough, especially in poor communities, which usually don't have much choice but to stay at home and wait for help to arrive. There is hope for deliverance, they say, from their collective anguish. Jamela Alindogan, Al Jazeera, Manila.
Two big companies say they're teaming up to develop technology that will alert people when they're close to someone who's infected. The idea is to help governments roll out apps to run on smartphones. Alexia O'Brien reports.
For many of us, technology is a major part of staying in touch during lockdown. From online workouts to church services and birthday parties. It's helping bring our communities together. But technology also has the potential to alert people when they've been close to anyone infected with the virus. Google is teaming up with Apple to develop apps to do just that. It's a rare collaboration between the American companies whose operating systems power 99% of the world's smartphones. But some fear the technology could also lead to more unwanted scrutiny of our private lives and personal data.
Google's business model is to track people. Google's a surveillance capitalist. Google makes its billions by tracking every move you make on and off the web.
Apple and Google say privacy, transparency and consent are of utmost importance in this effort, and they will openly publish information about their work for others to analyse. Governments worldwide are working out how technology can help us to identify sick people and stop the spread of the virus. Some countries, including Poland, Israel and Singapore, already use people's handsets to monitor their quarantine or send coronavirus alerts. South Korea is joining Hong Kong in using electronic wristbands, with some users asked to send a photo of their home to prove they're in self-isolation. That's aimed at getting the lockdowns and border restrictions lifted as soon as possible.
It's very new technology. It's very interesting, but a lot of people worry about it in terms of a person's freedom. We're going to take a look at that, a very strong look at it. We'll let you know pretty soon.
In China, where the outbreak began last year, mobile QR codes dictate whether people can leave the house and where they can go. Digital rights activists say such apps need to be designed so they can't be misused.
So today it's opt-in. We're not China. We'd never make you use this. But what happens tomorrow when it's on every iOS device and every Android device, and we start easing the lockdowns, and we say to people, you want to go back to work? You can, but here's the caveat, you have to turn it on. You have to opt into it, but it's your choice. You don't have to go to work, but if you want to go to work, you got to opt in.
Scientists admit technology alone won't be enough to eradicate the virus. Instead, it will need people's commitment in real life. Alexia O'Brien, Al Jazeera.
In other news, a court in Yemen run by Houthi rebels has sentenced 4 journalists to death. They were part of a group of 10 journalists who were accused of spying for the Saudi-UAE coalition. Amnesty International says the men are being held on false charges. It's calling for their immediate release. It's been 50 years since what NASA describes as a successful failure. The launch of the Apollo 13 mission never made it to the moon, and an explosion on board left 3 astronauts fighting for their lives. As Mike Hanna explains, the lessons learned will inspire a new generation of astronauts.
We've had a problem here. A barely audible uttering was an iconic phrase that became part of popular culture.
We've got a problem here.
Say again, please.
Houston, we have a problem.
The launch was routine. This was to be the third moon landing, and the mission commander, James Lovell, was on his fourth trip into space.
And it was just after about 55 hours into this mission that the explosion occurred.
Okay, now let's everybody keep cool.
The explosion in an oxygen tank destroyed the outer edge of the command module and shorted many of the intricate electronics keeping the craft in orbit. The idea of a moon landing was abandoned. The success of the mission was now to be measured by survival. The astronauts used the lunar model as a lifeboat, while dozens of scientists back at Mission Control worked out how to repair the systems, keep the astronauts alive, and get them back to Earth.
We gotta find a way to make this fit into the hole for this, using nothing but that. Let's get it organized.
Okay, let's build a filter.
Better get some coffee.
The world was transfixed by the drama taking place in space.
Lord, your astronauts will come back safe.
For a few days, all division was forgotten as millions around the globe willed the astronauts a safe return home. And 50 years later, a new generation of astronauts inspired by lessons learned from the Apollo 13 mission. Members of NASA's Artemis program, which is designed to put a man and woman on the moon by 2024, followed by a mission to Mars.
We learn more from our failures than we ever do from our successes.
Up in space, astronauts on the International Space Station continue their work, remembering the Apollo 13 mission in a video conference and paying tribute to the scientists on Earth, striving to keep them safe in the face of a pandemic.
It's changed the way that mission control operations worked. They're actually doing handover between shifts, between two different rooms to minimize the contact, but yet here they are persevering, and through their ingenuity and their professionalism, they're going to return us to Earth safely, just like their predecessors did 50 years ago.
I think Apollo 13 was a very good example of always expecting the unexpected. When I saw the parachute streaming out and then blossom, I knew by this time that unless we sunk in the Pacific Ocean, we would be successful.
A 50-year-old message that resonates in a world sheltering from pandemic. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, Washington.
This is Al Jazeera. These are the top stories. More than 20,000 Americans have died after contracting the coronavirus. The U.S. has surpassed Italy's death toll and now leads the world with the highest number of fatalities. New York is the epicenter of the virus with more than 8,600 deaths. The state governor says the situation is stabilizing. There's been a drop in the number of admissions to intensive care for the first time since the outbreak.
You can see that the number is somewhat stabilizing, but it is stabilizing at an horrific rate. 783 people, 777, 789. These are just incredible numbers, depicting incredible loss and pain.
UK health officials say the coronavirus outbreak has not yet reached its peak there, despite the death toll nearing 10,000. An 11-year-old was among the fatalities announced on Saturday. The government's urging people to stick to lockdown restrictions. There have been long queues outside supermarkets in Turkey after the government put 31 cities, including Istanbul and Ankara, under a 2-day curfew. Bakeries, hospitals, pharmacies and factories making medical equipment are exempt. The lockdown is due to end on Sunday at midnight. Researchers in China have discovered airborne traces of coronavirus can travel up to 4 meters away from patients. It had been thought to only reach 2 meters. The study tested surface and air samples from wards treating infected people at a hospital in Wuhan. The researchers found the virus was mainly concentrated on the floors. Some medical staff picked it up on their shoes. Pacific Island nations have been struggling to prepare for more coronavirus cases while dealing with the effects of a powerful storm. Cyclone Harold tore through a number of islands, destroying homes and leaving tens of thousands without power. Thousands have been forced into evacuation centres at a time when governments are trying to keep people apart. And those are the headlines. The news continues here on Al Jazeera after Talk to Al Jazeera. Goodbye.
As soon as the sun goes down, the shelling starts. Russia is a very challenging place to work from as a journalist. Even though the authorities here say you can't do it, it's not allowed, we are still pushing. We're always pushing our boundaries. Part of the center of Moscow is under a lockdown. People are being detained for peacefully marching here through the city center. We are the ones traveling the extra mile where other media don't go. We go there and we give them a chance to tell their story.
The attack on the 17th of October 2019 shocked Mexico. The Sinaloa drugs cartel took over the streets of the northern city of Culiacan with a devastating high-powered weaponry. From machine guns to AK-47 assault rifles, Mexican rival gangs were armed to the teeth, despite strict gun control. Gang members smuggled weapons across the border from the United States. About 70% of the guns seized in Mexico were traced to the US. Successive Mexican governments have asked the US to do more to stop the weapons flow. These calls for action have grown louder because of the country's highest murder rate in Mexico. One of the highest. But how is Mexico policing the border and dealing with those weapons once they're in the country? We talked to an arms trafficker, a hitman, and the wife of a victim of gun crime to try to get some answers. The Sinaloa cartel, which was led by El Chapo Guzman before his capture and extradition to the US, remains one of Mexico's largest powerful criminal organizations, and needs guns to reinforce. We've been told of so-called stash houses near the border, where weapons are stored once they've been smuggled in from the United States. So we arrived in Mexicali, just across the border from California, to try to get access to a stash house and speak to the gun runner in charge of it. After days of waiting, things began to move. We finally got the green light to visit one of the many stash houses that the Sinaloa cartel has, where they keep the guns that they've smuggled across the border from the United States before distributing them throughout Mexico. What happens here in this house?
Pues el papel de la casa es, te digo, llegan, pues cuando venimos con las armas, pues se pueden quedar un día o dos aquí en lo que nada más vienen a recogerlas. Ya cuando todo está listo para llevarlas para allá, pues ya las sacamos de aquí y se van para allá directamente.
Is this one of the only stash houses that the Sinaloa cartel has around here, or are there quite a lot of them across the border?
Ajá, pues yo me imagino que hay muchos, ¿no? Que hay muchos, pues como decir aquí donde estamos, pues es una. Yo tengo este y tengo otra nada más donde almaceno, porque igual no se quedan mucho tiempo aquí, casi la mayoría va para Culiacán.
So some of the guns are for the cartel for internal use then. Others of the guns, you sell them. Who do you sell them to? Do you sell them to other criminal groups?
Pues sí, a los mismos amigos. No necesariamente tienen que ser de otro grupo, ¿no? Pero pues a los mismos amigos, hay camaradas que también ocupan. Allá por lo regular la gente le gusta andar mucho armada. Sí, pues pues casi todos andan allá armados. La gente está remangada por allá. Y pues sí, así como le digo. Y las demás pues son para el cartel y para la guerra.
How easy is it to get them across the border from the United States to Mexico?
Pues la verdad, pues sí está bastante fácil cruzarla. Está bastante fácil, o sea, sí las tenemos escondidas, pero siempre es un clavo, así nomás, por encimita, así nomás en la tapicería o algo así, donde se puede, de alguna manera. Pues la aduana de allá para acá no se enfoca tanto en eso, en revisarte. Los que ellos andan más o menos ahí viendo, pues que no traigas tu mandado de más, o yo qué sé, que no compres muchas teles y que las quieras cruzar sin pagar.
So they're more worried about your groceries or what you might have bought in the United States legally than you bringing back guns then?
Que así es, sí, así es. Ellos están más preocupados en andar buscando todo ese tipo de cosas que les comento.
We saw that for ourselves when we made the journey from the US into Mexico on a busy Thursday night. On the Mexican side of the border, there were no passport controls, we saw no border officers and just 2 customs officials checking the long lines of cars. We're already through, we're into Mexico. Would you say that the police are really focused in trying to stop what you're doing or not really?
Pues no sé, no se ve que pues yo me dedico a esto y aquí no, si le digo, las veces que me han, como le digo, que me han agarrado casi han sido por descuidos míos. Han sido por descuidos míos, pero la verdad no, el gobierno aquí está, no andan enfocados en ese rollo.
Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard has said that the guns from the US are the most worrying issue and the government has plans to strengthen border security. We asked for an interview with him and Mexico's customs agency to discuss those border security plans. We didn't hear back. Meanwhile, weapons continue to flow across. What type of guns do you bring back usually?
Pues cortas, 9 milímetros, esas son las más usuales. Y de las largas, pues R15, cuerno de chivo, M16, esos son lo más usual, MP5.
Do you ever have problems with the Mexican authorities or the Mexican police for what you do?
Sí.
So what happened then?
Pues nos arreglamos con dinero y sí, cada quien de su lado, ni te conozco ni me conoces.
How would it affect your business if suddenly the border got closed to guns and you couldn't smuggle them in from the US anymore?
Si cerraran la frontera al contrabando de armas, bueno, pues me pegaré la madre, ¿no? Pero pues igual yo pienso que si no es por ahí es por otra parte.
Where else could you get them from though, in this sort of quantity?
No, pues así como lo hacemos por la frontera, así de fácil, pues no hay otra manera. Es lo más fácil que se puede hacer.
Mexico's in a moment in it's got a record murder rate, lots of violence. Do you think that if guns weren't readily available, if they couldn't come over the border from the United States, that would lower the murder rate in the country? That would...
La gente que la debe lo va a pagar, ¿me entiendes?
Many of the weapons that pass through this stash house are destined for the Sinaloa cartel's gunmen. We met one of them at a hotel in Mexicali. His job is to protect the cartel's cocaine and other assets and kill its enemies. He says he was there on the 17th of October when Mexican soldiers captured the son of El Chapo, Ovidio Guzman, in Culiacan, only for the cartel's gunmen to force them to give him up.
Yo respaldé esa postura porque considero que lo más importante es la acción.
It was a humiliation for the Mexican government and another potent sign of the Sinaloa cartel's power.
Y yo trabajo para el cártel de Sinaloa. Mi función, pues, cuidar directamente a un grupo de personas, jefes, nosotros le llamamos jefes. Todo el tiempo hay acuerdos contra otras organizaciones, pero muchas veces se rompen por muchas cosas, pues por quererse abarcar más la plaza de otras partes, por querer hacer cosas que no se pueden hacer o que está pactado no hacer, y al momento de romper con eso, pues hay consecuencias y eso se tiene que pagar.
What sort of weapons, what sort of guns do you and the people that work with you use?
Normalmente las más efectivas, por ejemplo, armas fuertes como las Glock 40, 45 más que nada se usa mucho. Armas largas, pues el teléfono es lo más usado. Para un enfrentamiento bien, está el 50, está también de calibre, dependiendo de la ocasión, pero que todo el tiempo traemos arriba los carros para cualquier cosa.
Where do the guns come from?
Obviamente todas venidas de Estados Unidos.
Do you also sometimes get weapons from the police or the military?
Sí, también esta vez desarmamos varias pandillas de guachos que andaban ahí en el refuego. También las desarmamos, eso tampoco nunca va a salir en la prensa, pues en el periódico, pero pues sí desarmamos varias camionetas de soldados militares.
Oh, well, so you disarm them and you take their arms by force then?
Sí.
Okay.
De estatales también.
Does it sometimes also happen, we've heard that the police and the army, not officially, but also officers or soldiers also sell their arms, sometimes to organised crime?
Sí, o sea, aquí, y por ejemplo, es común que mucha gente anda armada, que también aplica armas por agua sin que nosotros como el cártel también se dedican al tráfico de armas, y cuando hay un decomiso o algo, el mismo gobierno se queda con ellos. El gobierno tiene vínculos con el narcotráfico o con el crimen organizado, y ahí es cuando hacen sus ventas, pues, también pasa eso mucho. Entonces ellos, al decomisar un arma, pues muchas veces no, o decomisan un arsenal y muchas veces no mandan todo al cuartel o a donde lo llevan. Entonces cuando las armas que ellos se quedan, pues también le hacen su venta por...
In Culiacan, with what happened that time, were most of the people there on the side of the cartel armed with American guns then?
Sí, claro, pues todas las armas que manejan de otro lado, todos estamos armados con ese tipo de armas.
This confrontation between the cartel and Culiacan, that would if the Sinaloa cartel hadn't had this easy access to weapons, no?
Sí hubiera pasado, pero no, como dices, sí se pone más difícil de armas, ¿no? Y de donde vienen, o sea, a lo mejor no hubiéramos superado a ellos con el número de armas si no fuera tan fácil. Sí, viéndolo de esa manera, yo creo que sí estaría un poquito difícil si no se cerrara una puerta de allá al momento a poder conseguir el arma tan fácil. Pues. Sí se hubiera complicado. La cuenta de Puro. Que sí ha sido bastante.
Big art cause just for yourself?
No, yo creo que es responsabilidad, porque la verdad lo que digo, no lleves o no lleves nada. Si me dicen lleva así, te voy a llegar a que lo tengo que hacer porque lo tengo que hacer. La responsabilidad yo creo que es propia. Depende de por qué les va a tocar eso.
But many innocent people are also being killed in the crossfire. This burnt-out car is a wake-up call to the neighbouring United States.
Shut up.
3 women and 6 children were killed last October, all of them dual American and Mexican citizens. American-made bullets were found in the scene, and the guns were possibly made in Australia too. That story made headlines worldwide. All over Mexico for years. 6 murders a day on average were recorded in Tijuana last year. It's just over the border from San Diego in Southern California. Mexicans say their city's full of US guns. Yvonne's husband is one of many shot dead. These are 4-year-old Michelle and 10-year-old Danny alone.
En el acta de defunciones pusieron que fue muerte a balazos, que tenía balazo en el cráneo, en el hombro, pero pues no sabemos si lo torturaron, no sabemos si fue a golpes también. Pues nos ha afectado de todas maneras, económica, nos ha afectado también de manera pues que no estamos juntos, estamos distanciados, yo tengo que trabajar, las dejo solas, entonces pues de esa manera a mí me afectó porque pues él era mi apoyo.
How do you think that your story and the story of the family might have been different without this influx of guns coming from the US to Mexico?
Pues yo creo que fuera diferente porque hay demasiado asesinato, demasiadas muertes, demasiados casos sin resolver, personas desaparecidas por años, que los encuentran en México. Entonces yo creo que si realmente todo eso parara, el tráfico de armas, de drogas, pues estaríamos a lo mejor con un poco de paz, porque realmente el gobierno no hace nada de eso. Por detener eso no lo hace.
Is it possible that the gun that killed you came from the US?
Pues sí, porque pues todas las armas y la droga viene de Estados Unidos. Entonces, lamentablemente, pues al gobierno no le conviene que se sepa de que fue un arma americana. Y el gobierno no te dice, fue un arma americana, pero de antemano sabemos que todas las armas vienen de allá. Armas y droga, todo viene de allá.
And is it unusual to see people carry guns here?
Pues cualquier persona trae arma ahorita. Cualquier persona trae arma, ya pues he sabido de casos que se hacen de palabras en una taquería, en una gasolinera y ya los matan. Entonces cualquier persona tiene facilidades de traer un arma.
What happened when you tried to follow up with the authorities?
Pues ya al quererle dar seguimiento, pues te piden tiempo y te piden dinero. Es un proceso muy largo. Entonces yo realmente no cuento con el dinero para darle seguimiento. No lo hice también por mi seguridad, porque no sé qué tipo de gente fue, no sé a esa persona que lo respalde, a mí no me respalda, yo no tengo una seguridad para mí y para mis hijas, entonces también, pues por mi seguridad y por mi paz, pues mejor también lo hice.
What happened to your isolated case here, or are there more guns in the neighbourhood, more people getting killed?
Pues no ha sido el único caso, yo creo que últimamente, diario es una diarios a balazos, diario, es lo mismo, y por mucho tiempo, de un mes para acá, el tiempo de eso, entonces no se ha podido hacer nada. son casos que quedan sin resolver porque son demasiados los casos. Creo que aquí en Rosarito solamente hay 2 peritos para hacer el trabajo que tienen. Es demasiado trabajo y muy poca gente trabajando en eso.
Mexico's state attorney responsible for Tijuana told Al Jazeera that the staff wants to deal with the daily murders, but they're overwhelmed.
Una de las problemáticas que tenemos aquí en Baja California con Fiscalía es que tenemos mucha carga de trabajo y pocos fiscales. Entonces, no es que no se quieran atender todos los asuntos, ¿no? Por decir, tenemos en Baja California los primeros lugares de respeto a sus expedientes por fiscales. Tenemos un promedio en algunas áreas hasta de 600, 700 expedientes por fiscal.
He says that Mexican drug cartels, which have long relied on buyers in the US to get their weapons for them, are now using different tactics.
Compran en diferentes partes de tiendas de Estados Unidos legalmente, compran en parte las armas, las cruzan a México y aquí las arman. Y en Estados Unidos no se compró como arma, se compraron como en partes. Entonces son armadas y cruzadas de contrabando aquí a México. Primero el cañón, después todas las partes que se componen de un arma de este tipo, que una Glock son 4 o 5 piezas, y es imposible rastrear el origen de estas armas. Lo único que sabemos es que fueron compradas en partes
Method, I suppose, to buy them in Mexico for detection. Is that something new? About pure buyers buying guns and then those guns being smuggled over, but this method of buying guns in different parts, is that something that's new that we're seeing?
Sí, es algo nuevo de hace un año y medio para acá. Vamos a ver en particular el 80% de los homicidios, este tipo de arma, que es ensambladas calibre 40 milímetros. Entonces sí tuvimos un cambio el último año y medio en el empleo de armas en el homicidio aquí en Tijuana. Yo creo que es más fácil. ¿Por qué? Porque cualquier persona puede comprar una pieza de un arma. No hay un control, no hay un registro. Entonces yo puedo ir a comprar un pedazo de arma en Estados Unidos sin ningún permiso, sin ningún registro, y en otra parte de Estados Unidos voy a comprar el cañón. Entonces cuando tenemos una de estas armas en una escena del crimen, no tenemos manera de rastrear el arma. ¿Por qué? Porque no traen serie, no traen número, no traen nada, no hay una manera de identificarla.
So parts of guns bought in the US and then assembled in Mexico after crossing the porous border. What impact would it have on the homicide rate here in Tijuana if suddenly it became a lot more difficult to get guns over the border from the US to Mexico?
Yo creo que sí tuviera un impacto muy importante. Yo estuve en algunos estados de la República por mi trabajo por muchos años y me tocó ver homicidios en los cuales los delincuentes perdían las armas y querían recuperarlas. O sea, entonces, como es una forma muy fácil de adquirir las armas, claro que eso me puede generar en automático más homicidios.
We've been crossing over the border from the US to Mexico, and it's a sea of cars with maybe just one person from customs just checking all of that. It's very, very easy to get across, and there's not a lot of checks on that. How does that affect the job that you're trying to do and keep the murder rate down here? Because it seems like you could just get across a gun very, very easily.
Pues sí nos genera, ahora, obviamente sí genera una problemática, pues todos sabemos que históricamente la revisión que hace la autoridad en México para ingresar de cualquier parte de las fronteras, pues no es lo mismo que cruzar de aquí a Estados Unidos. Entonces sí tiene un impacto, tuviera que, en algún momento dado, si esto tuviera que ser diferente, creo que tuviera que ser todo un tema, cambiar la forma en que México recibe a sus visitantes y a sus propios connacionales, hacer un cambio pues muy radical que nunca existió en este país.
There seems no immediate answer in sight to the dilemma facing Mexican law enforcement agencies in combating weapons trafficking from the US. Will they tighten up their border and risk damaging business and tourism? Or will it remain business as usual?
Isolate, test, treat, and trace.
Frank assessments.
Why is Italy struggling to cope with the number of coronavirus cases?
Failure to take early aggressive action really put them behind the curve.
Informed opinions.
It's going to be much more challenging in a place like Haiti where there's one ventilator for 1 million people.
In-depth analysis of the day's global headlines.
Has India done enough to nip the spread of coronavirus in the bud?
Inside Story on Al Jazeera.
Perception is validation. We believe what we see, but in one lifetime, we cannot see everything. We rely on the experiences of others and the legacies of previous generations. Without testimony, we would know very little. Witness. Documentaries that open your eyes on Al Jazeera.
In the age of the coronavirus, information is more important than ever. 101 East investigates the battle for truth in China. On Al Jazeera.
A policy imposed decades ago.
No pregnant woman thought that she could selectively kill girls and have only boys.
Changing demographics across Asia with far-reaching consequences.
Creating a pool of socially disadvantaged
every level will be being given money. Money to agree to sterilization, or money to get other people to agree to sterilization.
Al Jazeera examines the politics of population control.
To become the country with the highest number of coronavirus deaths in the world. This is Al Jazeera live from Doha. Also coming up, the UK has warned the peak is yet to come there. Deaths top 900 for a second day. Handling the pandemic. Hear from doctors on the front line of the fight against the virus in Italy who say they'll never be the same. Plus,
it's the 50th anniversary of Apollo 13 mission, one that became a story of survival against all odds.
the US now has the highest number of coronavirus deaths in the world, 20,000 people. This tally passed Italy on Saturday. Across the country, at least 500,000 people are infected. New York, New Jersey, and Michigan. The epicenter remains in New York. And the city's using a mass burial site. But the state governor says for the first time, there's been a drop in intensive care's admissions. New York City is expected to have the rest of the academic year.
You see that the numbers stabilizing, but it is stabilizing at an horrific rate. 783 people, 777, 700. These are just incredible numbers. Incredible loss and pain.
York is not only the hardest hit state, it's also bearing the financial brunt of a nationwide lockdown. Krista Salumi has this report.
It's been called the crossroads of the world. But these days, no one's going anywhere. Just ask taxi driver Nikolai Kent.
People walking.
He says his lead customers are mostly hospital workers, now that all but essential workers are expected to stay home. New York, the center of American culture and commerce, now has more coronavirus cases than any single country.
Even the famously busy Grand Central Station is eerily quiet. During normal times, 750,000 people would pass through here each day. Now, as empty as public spaces are, hospitals are full.
Public hospitals in particular have been overwhelmed. Statistics show that the elderly or those with pre-existing conditions make up most fatalities. Minority communities have been hit disproportionately hard. And doctors and nurses are under tremendous pressure. A shortage of protective gear like masks and gowns is only adding to the strain for nurses like Sarah Dowd.
To do the best job possible, and that has a psychological effect, the feeling of being helpless.
Scenes of retirement trucks as makeshift wharves and funeral homes struggle with the enormous loss of life have been traumatic even for notoriously tough New Yorkers. State officials have lashed out at the federal government for not doing more to coordinate the response.
I'm bidding on a machine that Illinois is bidding on, and California is bidding on, and Florida is bidding on. And we're all bidding up each other.
While social distancing appears to be slowing the spread of COVID-19, nearly a month of school and business closures is a toll, leaving thousands of small business owners struggling to survive, like Jeff George, who owns a martial arts studio.
The thing is, continuing to be able to pay the rent and to pay utilities and pay the employees, right? We want to be able to sustain them as much as we can and help them. Right? That's important to me.
Still, New Yorkers are finding ways to bring people together with music, even if for now they can't get close. Inspired by scenes in Italy and Spain, they've been holding up the light social distance.
After this, and invite the whole block over to our lovely roof deck and be able to have everyone enjoy a song and a drink together.
But officials say that time is still weeks, if not months. Krista Salumi, Al Jazeera.
Allegedly, the name of the European countries have hit by the pandemic, but the pressure on hospitals and other world is easing. Nationwide lockdown extended until the beginning of May. Barbara Serra takes a look at Italy's worst crisis since the Second World War.
The coronavirus didn't start in Italy. The disease started to spread in small towns in northern Italy in February. Quarantine was imposed in Lombardy, one of the best health systems in the world was quickly overwhelmed, and the army pulled in with the bodies. The doctors were fighting a new disease which claimed not just science, but social conflict.
The nurses beside them because the therapists are not really allowed to be in touch. So that was really new for us, and also from the psychological point of view, it was very, very demanding. But this will be forever in our mind and in our soul, and I believe that never will be the same after that. I will not be the same.
As the death rate soared, Italy imposed a strict lockdown to curb contagion, and life changed beyond recognition. The world looked on aghast as Italy became the first European country to close schools, non-essential shops, and to tell people to stay home. Some of the most famous tourist attractions in the world emptied overnight, and images of the Pope praying alone in St. Peter's Square would have been unimaginable just a few weeks earlier. Singing from balconies may boost morale, but it does little to ease the enormous economic damage that such a strict and lengthy lockdown has inflicted. Speaking to Al Jazeera, Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte called for solidarity.
The European Union must show a swift and unified response to the repercussions of this pandemic. We have to provide answers about politics, finance, and economic policy because it's in our interest and the interest of other countries. This doesn't only concern Italy, but also Spain and all countries that face economic and social problems.
EU finance ministers have agreed a rescue package for member states damaged by the coronavirus, but it may still not be enough for a country that had financial problems even before the pandemic.
We still were under the wave of the old recession, and now this is hitting, especially the small and medium-sized Italian companies. The Italian manufacturing sector is still number 2 in Europe and number 6 in the world, so pretty robust. But it's made up of a network of small companies, and they are going down fast.
There is cause for optimism. Infection rates suggest Italy may have reached the peak of the crisis, but Italians still face several more weeks of lockdown. The 700 children who came together to witness Europe in a virtual choir will never forget this period of their lives. They're singing about hope in the face of adversity, in the hope that soon Italy and the world will win back against the coronavirus. Barbara Serra, Al Jazeera.
Marita Ciccone is the chair of anesthesia and intensive care at Milan Humanitas. Health systems have been overwhelmed.
Everyone ready from the very first day. We were seeing data from China even before it hit Italy, but when we found ourselves in the middle of the epicenter, it became very clear that the items that cases support, and up to 100% in our cases actually was requiring invasive mechanical ventilation. So the number of patients, the volume of patients sick coming to our intensive care unit was very high. Unfortunately, so far we don't have specific therapies against this virus. What we do have is good supportive care. So what we try to do in intensive care is we try to use what we learned from managing pneumonias, ventilated pneumonias for many years now. Is to try to keep our patients in our intensive care so that they can rest while we do the work of breathing for them. So we call some of the strategies protective lung strategies, because the ventilators that we use, they don't use the lung, they just give very precious time to the lungs to heal. So our job is the job to buy time for our patients so that their immune system can fight the virus.
Health officials in the UK say the outbreak is yet to reach its peak there as the death toll creeps closer. Numbers are starting to keep rising, but the report from London, there seems to be some hope.
The numbers are still very high, and they're expected to increase further in the coming days and weeks. Actually, this is in line with expectations as the emergency starts to the daily reaching the 1,000 level, thereabouts here in the UK. And in fact, in the last few days, the UK has already surpassed Italy and Spain, recording the highest number of daily deaths. You're also hearing from the director of NHS England, and he was saying that there has also been a flattening in the number of confirmed cases and also in the number of hospitalizations, and that is really important. So, and that's not just in London, but also in other parts of the country. But he did say that it will take some time for us to see the effect of that in the death toll figures because of this time lag of the virus. It takes time for die. And so because of that time lag, you are likely to see a continued increase in the death toll in the coming days and probably this week.
Still ahead in Al Jazeera, why health experts are concerned Africa will be the hardest hit by the coronavirus pandemic.
Hello, rain is leaving China. It's pushing this cloud south. But because it's quite cold air, it's virtually the warm waters of the western United. And it's got a circulation. You'll see from the colours, that's pretty heavy rain. So once again, for the major islands of Japan, rain is on its way. And with the rain, low temperatures. Osaka, we start off at 11 degrees. That rain lasted until Tuesday, then back up to 16 on Wednesday as it clears away, which is about the average. Now, of course, it's not going to stay in Osaka. It's rolling up the whole way through Honshu, and eventually will probably just touch Hokkaido as well. So a miserable day in Tokyo on Monday as well. But the sun's out behind, and it's warming up in Beijing, and at 22 in Hong Kong, it probably feels a little on the chill side in the morning because humidity is low and sunshine by day. South of this, a good scattering of big thunderstorms. Borneo is in focus, they're still in Java, they're still in Sulawesi. Increasingly, you'll see them in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, This is one of the up pulses. Kerala, but mainly temperatures are now rising steadily.
From the Al Jazeera London Broadcast Centre, two special guests in conversation.
I see resistance, and I see joy in the midst of pain. Your books do that.
Unprompted, uninterrupted.
Why are all of us people of color, and they're just one color?
They're just white.
They're just white, that's what I say.
Right.
Shouldn't they be people of no color?
Yeah, exactly.
Fatima Bhutto meets Mark Lamont Hill.
I very much thought I was going to get shot. It looked like a bad movie.
Studio B Unscripted on Al Jazeera.
Watching Al Jazeera, a reminder of our top stories this hour. More than 20,000 Americans have died after contracting the coronavirus. The US has surpassed Italy's death toll and now leads the world with the highest number of fatalities. New York is the epicenter of the virus with more than 8,600 deaths. The state governor says the situation is stabilizing. There's been a drop in the number of admissions to intensive care for the first time since the outbreak. UK health officials say the coronavirus outbreak hasn't yet reached its peak there, despite the death toll nearing 10,000. An 11-year-old was among the fatalities announced on Saturday. The government's urging people to stick to lockdown restrictions. The coronavirus pandemic isn't expected to peak in Latin America for another 2 weeks, but many in the region are already worried. Public health services are severely lacking, and some countries are already in a recession. The region's major cities have dense populations, and many have no choice but to ignore lockdown measures and go to work. And Latin America editor Lucia Newman reports from Santiago.
Bodies decomposing on the streets or inside houses in Ecuador's tropical city of Guayaquil. Cemeteries and funeral parlors can't cope with the demand. The government can only offer cardboard coffins for the latest victims. It's already a catastrophe, long before infections from COVID-19.
They wait for them to die before helping them, and when they're dead, they hand them over to the family.
Since March 1st, the pandemic has been spreading rapidly throughout Latin America. In Brazil, the country with the most deaths so far, drug lords are imposing quarantines in slums. That's because the president is still refusing to take strong measures at the expense of the economy. In Mexico, the government and the people appear dangerously nonchalant about social distancing and testing, even as coronavirus cases continue rising. By contrast, in Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Paraguay, and most of Central America, borders are closed and the army is on the streets to enforce partial or total quarantines to try to slow the curve of contagion. In Peru, for example, men are allowed to leave the house to shop on alternate days, and women on the other days, to keep more people off the streets.
I think it's a good idea to be able to control the messes a little bit because of the type of contagion that we're facing.
But it's not enough.
We don't have the capacity to confront this crisis as the developed countries do. Number one, in terms of the health systems and the access to the health systems, almost, I would say only 34% of the poorest of the poor have access to social protection. The rest don't have anything.
Latin America faces another tremendous handicap, a very high population density in its major cities, coupled with widespread poverty that fans the spread of disease. But the region faces an even bigger problem.
Maintaining a total quarantine for much longer in many of these cities will likely be forced, and for a very simple reason. 58% of Latin Americans are forced into a formal sector and faced with the choice of staying at home to starve or defying authorities. They would rather come out here and take their chances with the virus.
In many countries, hospitals are already running out of surgical masks and ventilators. Many people are already out of work. America may well be facing an unprecedented Lucia Al Jazeera, Santiago.
More than 30 million people in Brazil have signed up for emergency financial relief as lockdown restrictions affect the economy. The government's trying to streamline the payment process after thousands lined up at tax offices this week because of bureaucratic holdups. Informal workers are entitled to spend $100 million a month. Authorities have encouraged the public to stay at home after large gatherings were reported in 7 cities. Myanmar will ring in a new year next week, but celebrations will be muted because of the virus. Festivities have been cancelled and people are being urged to stay at home. But as Florence Louis reports, it hasn't stopped some workers trying to leave the cities and head to their hometowns.
Days before the Myanmar New Year starts, and this bus terminal is packed. People are leaving Yangon for their hometowns, despite government advice to stay home to prevent the spread of the coronavirus.
Yes, I am worried about the coronavirus. That's why I have to take precautions like wearing a mask, using hand sanitizers and washing hands. Everyone's doing it.
Myanmar has one of the lowest number of reported coronavirus cases in Southeast Asia. About half its cases are in Yangon, the biggest city. While the government has banned public gatherings, travel is allowed, raising concerns about spreading the virus everywhere.
They brought their tickets in advance. These are the people that go home every year. Since the factories they work in are closed, they don't have a place to stay in Yangon.
The owner says only half his normal number of buses are on the road. Fewer people are traveling this year, mostly migrant workers and no tourists. The Myanmar New Year, known as Tinjan, is usually celebrated with much fanfare and merrymaking. It's also known as the Water Festival. There'll be no water parties, public concerts, or street parades this year. Non-essential businesses have been ordered to shut. Only one person from each household is allowed to go out for medicine, healthcare, or food. For many, the restrictions are a financial burden.
It's not good for our business as we can't work. If we can't work, we have nothing to eat. I get paid for each day of work.
Others are slightly more optimistic.
We have to follow the government's order during Thingyan Festival. The government made the order because the world is in serious trouble, so they have to protect the country. It's for all of us.
Like many countries around the world, Myanmar is relying on everyone to stay home to break the chain of transmission. Florence Louis, Al Jazeera.
Africa felt the effects of the coronavirus later than other continents, and now many health experts are concerned it'll be hit the hardest. Malcolm Webb reports from Kenya's capital.
Eating grilled meat in pubs is part of daily life in Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Selling it is big business. That all ground to a halt when the government ordered restaurants closed to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. All the grills on this strip have closed. All the workers have been laid off.
All is not well. We must adhere to the measures. But our customers are scared to come for even takeaway. We have nowhere to turn to for help.
The grilled meat traders here are among millions across Africa who've already lost their livelihoods because of restrictions on movement and trade. Shoppers in Kenya's supermarkets have to keep distance and sanitize their hands. But shops like this are the domain of the middle class, which in most African countries is tiny. Crowded markets like this are more normal. There simply isn't space for people to keep distance here, and it will be impossible to enforce it. But for the people that trade in places like this and people that buy food here, they don't come here in the daytime, they go hunting in the morning. And it's the same story for millions of people in cities across the continent. The Democratic Republic of Congo has locked down the central commercial district of its capital, Kinshasa. In most of the rest of the city, with about 12 million, people are still out and about trying to trade.
They don't go out to find work, they won't find to the containment measures that they're instituting elsewhere. And in the absence of social protection, you're going to see
South Africa's army has been accused of abuses and trying to stop the upheaval when it was the lockdown. The country recorded more cases of the virus than anywhere else on the continent, possibly because it's carried out a test. The lockdown seems to have succeeded infections. In much of the rest of the country, hospitals and health ministries recorded relatively low so far. Many living in crowded conditions in the slum in Nairobi, health experts say the worst is yet to come.
Staying at home, but also taking care of the social needs of the population. Some of them report out and will bring in a lot of
as long as markets are busy, like this one in Nairobi, it helps the virus spread. Empty markets, hunger, and rest. The government faces difficult decisions in the weeks ahead. Millions of people will face the consequences. Malcolm Webb, Al
India have been monitoring the visibility of skirmishes in Kashmir for the last 2 days. Pakistan civilians near the line of control, and the Indian army says it killed 5 Pakistani-backed fighters in a gun battle after losing 5 of its own soldiers. Both sides claim the entire.
There's been intense shelling throughout the night. My house is completely damaged, and so are a few others nearby.
We've suffered huge losses here in our village. Many homes are destroyed by the shelling. The world is fighting a coronavirus pandemic, while we people living on the border have to also face this pandemic of routine shelling.
At least 2 people have been killed and 4 others are missing after a dam collapsed in northern India. It released a wave of toxic sludge. Several homes were engulfed and farmland has been swamped. The dam contained ash from a coal-fired power station in Madhya Pradesh. A volcano in Indonesia, which has erupted 6 times since Friday, has sent plumes of ash into the skies. Wind blew the ash from Anak Krakatau to neighbouring villages, but there have been no reports of damage. In 2018, an eruption caused an underwater landslide and a tsunami that killed more than 400 people. It's been 50 years since what NASA describes as a successful failure. The launch of the Apollo 13 mission never made it to the moon, and an explosion aboard left 3 astronauts fighting for survival. But the lessons learned have inspired a new generation of astronauts, as Mike Hanna explains.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
A barely audible uttering was an iconic phrase that became part of popular culture.
Hey, we've got a problem here.
Say again, please.
Houston, we have a problem.
The launch was routine. This was to be the third moon landing, and the mission commander, James Lovell, was on his fourth trip into space.
And it was just after about 55 hours into this mission that the explosion occurred.
Okay, now let's everybody keep cool.
An explosion in an oxygen tank destroyed the outer panels of the command module and shorted many of the intricate electronics keeping the craft in orbit. The idea of the moon landing was abandoned. The success of the mission was now to be measured by survival. The astronauts used the lunar model as a lifeboat, while dozens of scientists back at Mission Control worked out how to repair the systems, keep the astronauts alive, and get them back to Earth.
We gotta find a way to make this fit into the hole for this, using nothing but that. Let's get it organized.
Okay, let's build a filter.
The world was transfixed by the drama taking place in space.
Lord, your astronauts will come back safe.
For a few days, all division was forgotten as millions around the globe willed the astronauts a safe return home. And 50 years later, a new generation of astronauts inspired by lessons learned from the Apollo 13 mission, members of NASA's Artemis program, which is designed to put a man and woman on the moon by 2024, followed by a mission to Mars.
We learn more from our failures than we ever do from our successes.
Up in space, astronauts on the International Space Station continue their work, remembering the Apollo 13 mission in a video conference and paying tribute to the scientists on Earth, striving to keep them safe in the face of a pandemic.
It's changed the way that mission control operations worked. They're actually doing handover between shifts, between two different rooms to minimize the contact, but yet here they are persevering, and through their ingenuity and their professionalism, they're going to return us to Earth safely, just as their predecessors did here.
I think Apollo 13 was a very good example of always the unexpected. When I saw the parachute sticking out in the blossoms, by this time that
A 50-year-old message that resonates in a world sheltering from home. Mike Moore, Al Jazeera.
More than 20,000 people in the US have died after contracting coronavirus. The country has surpassed Italy's death toll on Saturday and now leads the world with the highest number of fatalities. New York is the epicenter of the virus with more than 8,600 deaths. The state governor says the situation is stabilizing. There's been a drop in the number of admissions to intensive care for the first time since the outbreak.
You can see that the number is somewhat stabilizing, but it is stabilizing at an horrific rate. 783 people, 777, 799. These are just incredible numbers, depicting incredible loss and pain.
UK health officials say the coronavirus outbreak there hasn't yet reached its peak, despite the death toll nearing 10,000. An 11-year-old was among the fatalities announced on Saturday. The government is urging people to stick to lockdown restrictions. More than 30 million people in Brazil have signed up for emergency financial relief as lockdown restrictions affect the economy. The government's trying to streamline the payment process after thousands lined up in tax offices this week because of bureaucratic holdups. Informal workers are entitled to claim $180. In other world news, Pakistan and India have have been locked in renewed military skirmishes over the disputed Indian-administered Kashmir region for the last 3 days. Pakistan says Indian shelling has killed 6 civilians near the so-called line of control, and the Indian army says it killed 5 Pakistani-backed fighters in a gun battle after losing 5 of its own soldiers. Killed and 4 others are missing after a dam collapsed in northern India. It released a wave of toxic smoke. Several homes have been engulfed and farmland has been swamped. The dam contained ash from a coal-fired power station. Those are the headlines coming up next.
Who will pay for the financial fallout of the coronavirus pandemic? Governments around the world invest trillions of dollars to try and keep their economies afloat. Will the another global financial crisis? This is Inside Story. Bernard Smith. Most economists agree the coronavirus pandemic has put the world into recession. Trade and business abruptly stopped when billions of people were told to stay at home. Governments are pledging huge stimulus packages to try and reduce the damage. The European Union has agreed a $590 billion rescue package to prop up the worst-hit economies, such as Spain and Italy. That includes unemployment benefits, loans for small businesses and healthcare services. The EU leaders disagree on how to share the cost. The French finance minister called this the most important economic plan of the EU's history.
The fund contains bold and ambitious proposals that would have been received just a few weeks ago. We can all remember the response to the financial crisis of the last decade, when Europe did too little, too late. This time around is different.
Other countries, such as Australia, Britain, China and India, have unveiled multi-billion-dollar rescue packages. And the biggest bailout in US history has been unveiled by Congress, $2.25 trillion. That will cover unemployment benefits, loans and direct payments to every American. The International Monetary Fund says the world is facing the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression in the 1930s.
The encouraging news is that all governments have sprung into action, and indeed that is significant. Our monitor next week will show that countries around the world have taken actions amounting to $8 trillion. And in addition, there has been massive work from the G20 and others.
Let's introduce the panel. In London, Vicky Price, the Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economic Business. Sweden, Husa Lee Makiyama, Director at the European Centre for International Political Economy, and also in Britain's capital, Greg Swenson, the investment banking firm Brigg McAdam. Welcome to you all. Vicky, first of all, this will be a question for all of you. Combined global major international economies putting trillions of dollars into trying to recover from the global of the coronavirus. Will it be enough to stave off a major global recession or minimise?
For example, the Fed in the States putting an extra over $2 trillion US dollars in liquidity in the market. So it's obviously been understood what has been done so far. Similar to what we've seen in a number of countries. countries probably isn't going to be enough. But very much is going to depend on how quickly we get out of this. There are, of course, a number of countries that are already showing some sort of signs that they have an exit strategy. So we might see beginnings of maybe going out of this lockdown. There's so many places are facing right this minute, but it's going to be very tentative. So the likelihood is that governments will have to come back, and if it takes longer than anticipated, then with it, of course, both budgets will be going up and deficits will be increasing very significantly. So, and also monetary authorities may have to do more. We just don't know right now, but what they've done so far was an absolute must. And as I said, we may need to do more.
Husuk, what they've done so far is an absolute must. Is there enough that the global economies have pumped into the system to stave off the worst?
Well, everybody has been engaged in, trying to cater to their own economies, I guess. As we heard, the US package is probably about 10% of its GDP. Perhaps the most impressive package has been coming so far from Japan, which is almost spending a quarter of its GDP and 1/3 of it going to actually businesses and households, and spending almost 110% of its annual budget. The real underachiever here in this context is probably Europe, where we have so far only seen $500 billion committed on a European level. And, we have countries like Germany who has committed about 750 billion. But overall, it is quite underwhelming, and we have still a very bumpy road ahead under the second quarter.
Okay, we'll come back to Europe in a second, but globally, Greg, do you think overall we're going to stave off a severe global recession?
Well, I'm not sure that that's even possible, no matter how much money is thrown at this thing, from central banks as well as from governments. So I think the issue is, how bad and how quickly can we get out of this? And that's all going to be driven, as I think we'd all agree, by the progress in fighting the coronavirus and increasing the testing that's necessary in order to flip the switch on these economies. It won't be a V shape. It's going to be a bumpy road. But I think the sooner that we can get back to work, then the less money that will be required from governments in the form of stimulus.
And Vicky, do you think that Europe, the European Union, Eurozone countries are, if you like, letting us down on this and be come up with much more?
Well, as we heard, some countries are doing quite a lot. For example, Germany. Others can't really afford that. That includes Italy, Greece, Austria, Spain. So what we have is a bit of an unequal reaction to this. So all the eyes were on what the Eurozone might do, what the Eurogroup might do within Europe generally. So what we have so far is the European Central Bank is stepping in quite significantly with an extra funds to purchase securities worth about 750 billion over the next year. What they're going to do, of course, is also buy Greek bonds for a change. So at least it allows governments in Italy, Greece, etc., to themselves go out and have access to the capital markets. So that's good news. But in terms of sharing the burden a little bit more equally, what we've got from the European Union in terms of the latest package of 500 billion euros and thereabouts, there's been a certain amount of direct support to countries through the lending, mainly using the ESM, which is basically facilitating to create a financial crisis. This is a loan which has no conditions, even though some northern countries don't have those conditions. But that's good news. That's about 250 billion of that 500. We have some help for the unemployed in the sense of encouraging firms to keep their workers on their books, about 100 billion. We have extra money coming to firms via the European Investment Bank. This is quite good news, but it is about 1/3 of what the European Central Bank has said needed in terms of fiscal stimulus across the EU. That's why I said at the beginning we might need a little bit more. We haven't finished, I think, there. We don't have any serious shared risk-taking in the form of Corona bonds or Euro bonds that many countries wanted. So yes, it is quite limited at present, and quite a lot of countries are going to end up having borrowed a lot more, and the worry is what's going to happen when we come out of it, assuming we do in a reasonable way, in terms of needing to retrench again. So we had this terrible period of austerity for the last 10 years, and are we going to see it again?
Husuk, that is my next question. How are we going to pay for this? Who is going to pay for it? The Labour and these eye-watering amounts of money have to come from somewhere.
Well, indeed. So far, we are seeing a repeat of the discord we saw during the Euro crisis, which basically means that everybody pays for themselves. As we heard, there are no joint corona bonds, there are no mutualization of debt. And in the northern countries, I think the population as well as the political leadership remember very clearly that when they created the euro, that there was not going to be a transfer union. There was not going to be the massive savings in the north and the huge debt in the south, and the money would basically move from north to south. That was not supposed to happen. And so, in a word, I mean, I don't necessarily sympathize with that point of view, but there is a very good point, which is that Spain and Italy could easily issue bonds that European Central Bank could simply buy. In other words, the mutualization and the joint bonds are more of a political symbol, which could be very important for calming down the market. But in other words, it doesn't actually add anything in terms of what we can do in terms of fiscal terms. And one thing that is also very clear, which is that if you look at the north, which is basically Netherlands and Germany at this stage, are represented by the same people who negotiated during the Euro crisis. We are looking at the Prime Minister Mark Rutte of Netherlands, and we are looking at Angela Merkel. She's probably going to still be here by the time I'm dead. But whereas on the southern side, we have people like Macron, Spain, and Prime Minister Sanchez in Spain, and also Conte in Italy. They're all newcomers. And another factor that I don't think we should forget about is the fact that President Obama is no longer here, which means that United States played a pivotal role in forging a compromise among these two countries, and that mechanism, that power is no longer here.
Greg, we know about the grumbling from northern European countries unwilling to what they describe as subsidise southern European members, but are we going to head back to austerity? And what would that austerity be? Would it again be cuts to public services? Or are we going to see tax rises instead this time?
Well, it's probably going to be a combination of both, although I'm not sure how much more you can raise taxes in a place like Italy. The last 10 years hasn't really worked in terms of long-term planning or a long-term solution. I mean, Italy's got debt to GDP of 135%, Spanish debt to GDP 98%. These countries don't really have the ability to issue very much more debt. I mean, it's a good point. Issue bonds in other countries and have the ECB purchase indirectly from there's a long north-south divide, and that's what it's a lot of political and psychological, not just purely economic. The National Mohammed time has come out last week, 70% of the Italian economy, and only 16% disagreed with that. Set the context of about the potential of the EU failing if we don't issue a bill. There's real opposition to that in the north, not just in Germany and the Netherlands, but in Austria and Finland as well. And so there's a really tough situation. They're either going to have to issue these bonds rules that they when they put the EU together, or if they come down together. I think it's going to be really difficult.
Victor, we're talking about end to commercial activity almost everywhere in the world. Spending is about 2/3. How long would it take?
The problem is that in the process of slowing down and shutting the supply and demand with all these measures to control the markets, we're also reducing really very so cooling the ability of consumers to lost a lot of jobs in employment, quite a lot of them, they won't have the purchasing power there to come back and demand all the things that they were able to get while they were in lockdown. But there will be recovery nevertheless, but how fast that recovery will be will depend hugely on whether the consumer then feels quite optimistic about employment issues, whether they think that the health situation really has improved so they can go back to work and they feel safe for themselves and their families. It's going to take quite some time. So we're not going to have the type of sort of impact that perhaps the lowering of interest rates back at the time of the financial crisis and the extra liquidity that was given to individuals and firms had then repeat itself now. It's going to be a much longer process, but a recovery there will be. But getting back to the types of levels we were at before, remember countries like Italy, in terms of per capita GDP, are still below in real terms where they were before the financial crisis. And even in the UK, we've only just got back in terms of hourly wages in real terms being where they were before the financial crisis here too. So it is going to be a long process, unfortunately, and therefore the government will have to be involved in all this. And those deficits will be quite high and those debts will increase. At some point, we'll have to do something about that. Either we ignore everything that the central bank has bought in terms of bonds in the market, in the secondary market, and writes them off, or something else we need to give, because those levels of debt are simply not sustainable for the longer term if you want growth again to be happening.
Husuk, the direct intervention that governments have taken in supporting salaries, subsidising salaries, or sending people cash payments, will that encourage people to continue spending, you think, and minimise the effects of a recession?
Well, I mean, as we heard before, it's actually quite refreshing from hearing from my fellow panelists, because economists usually say that, you know, we are in uncharted territories. It's actually quite refreshing for three of us that admit that we don't know. But the general rule of thumb is that, well, for every week of shutdown of the scale that we've seen, we lose about 1% of GDP. Now, as we were saying before, we are looking at quite a number of events in the second quarter, and possibly in the third will basically make the stimulus package we are discussing now something of a history. We are looking already at the second and perhaps the third wave of infections coming into places like Singapore and Japan, which will spread further. We are also looking at a collapse of the international trade. WTO issued a report saying that actually the global trade, which has just recovered after the 2010 crisis, it might drop as much as 1/3, which would be unprecedented, and which is also a scale of a global war. And now, I mean, if you look at economies like, for example, Germany and France, actually, half of the GDP in Germany come actually from export. If that market collapses, it basically means that it doesn't really matter what you do to support your salaries, because in the end, you know, the half of your GDP will be gone because the customer is gone. And then we have also much more long-term speculation that we need to take into account, because there's no doubt, for example, that those countries who come out of the tunnel will be probably China. And on one hand, China will be forced to reform into building some form of social security network. But on the other hand, extremely export-dependent economies like Europe, but also to a certain extent, US financial institutions who are really depending on investment in China, will see that they will be more dependent on China than ever before. We're already seeing a tendency towards this. For example, if you look at the business data, which seem to suggest that China is currently sucking up quite a lot of foreign direct investment, as well as production capacities that actually left China. There's now a reversal of a trend that started with the trade wars now, with the quite a lot of capital and production capacity moving back to China, because that's probably where you want to be in a global pandemic.
And Greg, many Americans will be getting checks of up to $1,200. Employment benefits have been extended and enhanced. That's immediate. Is that, you think, the best way to keep an economy like the US ticking over at least?
Well, I mean, historically, and I would say, you know, theoretically, philosophically, absolutely not. things never work. It's short-term gimmicks. You know, they tried that. George Bush tried that in 2002 with a $600 called a tax refund. It was basically a transfer payment. They did it again with the Democrats in 06. And look, it never works. However, there has to be an exception in this case because the government has in fact shut down the economy. So I think it's absolutely critical that they get money into the hands of the people that need it right away, immediately. So it's not designed to be a stimulus. It's not a stimulus. It's a relief, really. It's basically a relief package, and I think that's important to do because of the government's role in this. However, the sooner we can step back from that and get people back to work, let the free markets work, you know, the sooner we do that, the better in terms of the recovery. So, you know, again, historically, these short-term gimmicks don't work. It basically is a transfer payment, and it doesn't really stimulate the economy. I think the best way to stimulate it is to deregulate and reduce the taxation burden on workers. And so, look, you know, it was a near-term relief that was important, and it was the right thing to do. But for sure, it's not really a stimulus to the economy.
I just want to ask you about something you touched on in your last answer. What if governments don't repay all this money that they're printing? What if the central banks buy their own government bonds? Why not repay it? Why not just put it off to the next generation and the next generation write it off? Could that be possible?
It is possible. I mean, remember, of course, that everyone borrowed a lot, and certainly the UK did. Had a huge debt-to-GDP ratio after the Second World War, and we want to just stop paying it, basically. So you can extend. I mean, we're borrowing very cheaply. You can extend the repayment periods possibly, so a lot of restructuring might take place. But otherwise, yes, I'm afraid you may have to just write it off. And the central banks may just have to start again because, of course, their balance sheets will increase very significantly because of all the operations they're doing right now. But pushing it into the longer term may well be what they decide to do on much better terms, if you like. But if you borrow right now, if you look at what's going on, whether it's here or elsewhere in terms of developed nations, the rates that are being paid for, the yields, say, 10-year bonds right now that the UK can borrow are very low. They are below 0.5, so 0.5. So very low rates. Even when you look at 30-year bonds, you can borrow here at 0.75. So way below 1%. So we can do it. You can probably, pay, repay the interest over a period of time, very low, and you don't have to repay the actual bond for ages. You can survive, but not many countries across the world will be able to do that. And I worry a little bit about the Southern European countries. I also worry about the developing world, where I'm suspecting we're going to see some defaults at some point, and the International Monetary Fund is already getting geared up to deal with that by being prepared to put a lot more money into those countries and also looking at their debt situation. I'm suspecting that many countries will fall by the wayside and they have to start again. So yes, we have to really look at the whole debt situation afresh. But for the moment, I think what we have to focus on is on getting to the next phase at least, where growth can start again.
So do you think perhaps more developed economies could get away with not repaying the money they're printing?
Well, that's called defaulting, is it? No. I think another popular phrase that economists like to say nowadays that we are all Japanese now, which basically means that we are looking at a significantly larger government debt in conjunction with relatively abysmal growth rate. And actually, the only country that's grown out of that is Japan, that's basically under Prime Minister Abe restored some of the faith in the economy and also the growth of the economy and the market growth and the corporate profit. But I think Europe definitely is looking at that scenario even to begin with. If that was the baseline, I can really see that we are looking at a significant increase of debt.
And Greg, all the quantitative easing, the money printing that there was after the financial crisis didn't lead to skyrocketing inflation that people were scared of then. So why should we worry now about creating all this debt?
No, it's a great point. I think a lot of us were concerned about inflation and some of the unintended consequences of these central banks levering up. And, you saw the ECB and the Fed at basically at 25% of GDP in terms of their balance sheet. So look, I think it's something that we have to consider. I think we shouldn't ignore it, because if there is some inflationary pressures and interest rates go up, it's going to be really difficult for economies to pay back their debts, especially in developing countries. You've already seen the African finance ministers get together last week and decide to stop interest payments on many of the debt instruments. It's something that we have to consider. So hopefully we make all of these government measures short-term in nature so that the balance sheets don't blow up too much.
Well, unfortunately, we're already out of time and looking forward to the next crisis, it seems. But for the moment, I'd like to say thanks very much to all our guests, Vicky Price, Hoosuk Lee Makiyama and Greg Swenson. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Bernard Smith, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.
Crossing borders, breaking boundaries, recording injustice, fighting inequality. From Africa and Asia to Europe.
I use exile as a power of mind, of a power of spirit. Everywhere I go now, for me, is one country.
Al Jazeera World meets 4 refugees who've come to Europe, touched people's lives, and made a difference. A hard road from home, photographers and activists on Al Jazeera.
There are people in the world who want all forms of verification to just go away. So we need people fighting against that.
We are trying to see if it's a fake video, maybe in Syria, but in a different time.
They risk a great deal to find out the truth in very complex situations that include major global players.
We've been targeted by cyber attacks from Russia. There are dangers in doing this kind of work.
Bellingcat. Truth in a post-truth world on Al Jazeera.
I'm Rob Matheson in Doha. The top stories on Al Jazeera. The US now has the highest number of coronavirus deaths in the world, 20,000 people. Its tally passed Italy on Saturday. Across the country, at least 500,000 people are infected. More than half of the deaths are in 3 states, New York, New Jersey and Michigan. The epicenter remains New York. The surge of deaths there has overwhelmed funeral homes, and the city's using a mass burial site. Earlier, I spoke to John Hendren in Chicago and asked him what the latest death toll means for the United States.
Every day, we seem to hit a new grim milestone. On Friday, it was that the United States had crossed 500,000 recorded cases of the coronavirus. On Saturday, it is that the U.S. has now registered 20,000 deaths, more than any other country, including Italy. And as you point out, 1/3 of those cases was from New York State alone, New York, New Jersey, and Michigan being the hardest hit of all states so far. And U.S. health officials say they believe that the infections are going to peak on Easter Sunday, this coming Sunday. That was originally a date when President Trump had said he wanted the U.S. to come out of the shelter-in-place orders and wanted business to be back and moving again. That is no longer happening. That date seems to have moved to May 1st, and there are a lot of public health officials who are skeptical even about that date. But there are places here in the United States where pastors are keeping churches open. Most states, 43 states, have lockdown orders. 7 of them do not. But of the states that have lockdown orders, something like 15 of them allow an exemption for church services. So there is some fear that here on Easter Sunday, there will be places where massive amounts of people will be gathering. But Anthony Fauci, the head of the National Institutes of Health here in the United States, says that there won't be a sense of normalcy here in the U.S., Rob, until something like November. And that, of course, is when President Trump is up for re-election.
Health officials in the UK say the outbreak there is yet to reach its peak as the death toll creeps closer to 10,000. The numbers are expected to keep rising. But as Mariam Namazi reports from London, there seems to be some hope.
The numbers are still very high and they're expected to increase further in the coming days and weeks. Actually, this is in line with expectations as the emergency starts to reach its peak. You can see the daily death toll reaching the 1,000 level or just thereabouts here in the UK. And in fact, in the last few days, the UK already surpassed Italy and Spain for recording the highest number of daily deaths. Now, interestingly, you're also hearing from the director of NHS England, Stephen Powis, and he was saying that there has also been a flattening in the number of confirmed cases and also in the number of hospitalizations, and that is really important. So that's not just in London, but also in other parts of the country. But he did say that it will take some time for us to see the effect of that in the death toll figures because of this time lag with the virus. It takes time for an infected person to start to show symptoms, and then there's again time before they deteriorate to the point of needing to go to hospital, and then sadly if they might die. And so because of that time lag, you are likely to see a continued increase in the death toll in the coming days and probably this week.
More than 30 million people in Brazil have signed up for emergency financial relief as lockdown restrictions affect the economy. The government's trying to streamline the payment process after thousands lined up at tax offices this week because of bureaucratic holdups. Informal workers are entitled to claim $118 a month. Now, in other world news, at least 2 people have been killed and 4 others are missing after a dam collapsed in northern India. It released a wave of toxic sludge. Several homes were engulfed and farmland has been swamped. The dam contained ash from a coal-fired power station in Madhya Pradesh. And those are the headlines. The news continues here on Al Jazeera after Studio B, Unscripted.
There's no punchline to state violence.
Yeah.
Sometimes stuff is just bad.
Pop culture is not innocent. It's coded with all kinds of politics.
The white mainstream feels that a shift is happening.
They're nervous.
They're nervous.
Yeah. I like my feminists sort of murder-free.
Hi, I'm Marco Mondale. I can help an outcome that is freedom, justice, equality, and self-determination for everybody. I'm an academic, a writer, a journalist.
My name is Fatima Bhutto, and I'm from Pakistan. I think some ideas are too dangerous to do except in novel form.